The people had gathered to welcome back their hero. The hero rode in on a horse, waving at the crowd. The MC, who wore armor, tried to warn the people to stay back because it was dangerous. Inside, the MC was already getting tired of how worked up everyone was getting. The hero looked over at the MC, and when the MC shot an annoyed look back, the hero simply winked playfully. That only made things worse. The girls in the crowd went wild, and everyone started pushing in closer. Some of the girls were arguing with each other, each one convinced that the wink or the smile had been meant for her. The MC thought to himself that the hero had done that on purpose just to stir everyone up even more. Later, somewhere else entirely, a door opened and a man let in someone wearing a cloak. The place was full of noise and chatter. The cloak figure walked through the crowd and stopped in front of the MC, who was sitting up on a table. The cloaked person pulled back the hood and turned out to be Werner. Werner pointed out that the hero probably should not be in a place like this. The hero, Mazel, pointed right back that Werner was not exactly in a position to talk. Werner ordered his usual ale. Mazel said he knew he could always count on Werner for that. They raised their mugs, Werner offering a toast to Mazel's safe return home. They both drank deeply, emptied their mugs, and let out a burp at the same time. Mazel made it clear he much preferred this kind of place over some fancy, stiff gathering. Werner, for his part, agreed that some things just suited a person better than others. Werner thought about the first time he had met Mazel. Back then, he had wanted nothing to do with him at all, but life had a way of throwing things at you that you never expected. Werner himself being in this world at all was proof enough of that. In his previous life, Werner had been a completely ordinary Japanese man. He grew up in a plain household, worked at an unremarkable company, and lived as the kind of person nobody really notices. He was, in every sense, a background character. Then one day, a carriage carrying children tipped over. The oldest child did not survive, and the next thing Werner knew, he was waking up in what felt like a world straight out of medieval Europe. A servant's voice called out that Lord Werner had woken up. A woman's voice thanked the servant, and then the woman herself appeared, saying Werner's name with relief in her voice. Werner quickly pieced together what had happened. This was a reincarnation into another world, the kind of thing that happens in stories. But the world he had landed in was not just any fantasy setting. It was the world of a game he had once played in his past life. A classic RPG where a brave hero defeats a demon lord and saves the world. That sounds exciting, except Werner knew the full story. In the second half of the game, the demon lord's forces invade the capital city and burn it to the ground. That destruction serves as the dramatic backdrop before the hero eventually gets crowned as king. And Werner had realized, with growing dread, that he lived right in the middle of where all that destruction was supposed to happen. On top of that, Werner was an aristocrat who was never once mentioned in the game. A nameless, faceless background character. The kind that probably dies without anyone noticing. He had no intention of letting that happen to him. So Werner trained without stopping. He gripped his spear and pushed himself hard, day after day, building up his fighting ability so that he could at least keep himself alive. Over time, all that effort paid off, and he eventually earned a place at the capital's academy. One day at the academy, while Werner was sitting quietly with a book, a classmate came over and waved at him, teasing him about always having his nose buried in something. Werner brushed it off. The classmate then clapped his hands together and asked Werner to explain something he could not figure out in political science class, flattering Werner as the top student in their grade. Werner knew the truth, though. He was not some brilliant scholar. He was just a hard-working spearman trying his best to survive, and he happened to do well in subjects that lined up with things he had already studied in his previous life. The classmate also mentioned, with a grin, that there were girls at the academy who looked at Werner with interest. Werner figured that had more to do with the fact that his father was a count than anything about Werner himself. Besides, if anyone was truly popular around here, it was someone else entirely. Werner's eyes drifted across the room toward a cluster of noise and movement. There was Mazel Harding, surrounded by a crowd of students as usual. Mazel was the main character of the game Werner had been reincarnated into. Despite coming from a common background with no noble blood, Mazel had gotten into the academy on a special scholarship because of his rare and exceptional abilities. For one reason or another, a huge number of people had taken an interest in him. Werner still could not quite believe they were in the same year. It was Mazel's arrival at the academy that had confirmed for Werner that this world was moving along the same path as the game he remembered. From that point on, Werner had been doing his best to act like a proper background character, keeping quiet and staying out of things so that the story could unfold the way it was supposed to. He very much wanted to avoid getting tangled up with Mazel at all. But then something caught his eye. A young woman was offering Mazel sweets, telling him there was something her home country was proud of. Mazel cheerfully accepted. Werner watched from a distance. He recalled that the girl was an exchange student from the neighboring country of Salzanak and the daughter of a duke there. Events like this happened often at the academy, with students hosting little tea gatherings in the cafeteria that were really just thinly veiled chances for matchmaking. Girls chasing after good-looking boys were not the sort of thing Werner normally paid any attention to. But this time was different. Just before Mazel had walked over, Werner had spotted the girl quietly drinking something from a small bottle. That was the thing that had him paying attention now. He did not know for certain what she was planning, but she had been pushing her sweets on Mazel very persistently, and Werner had a strong feeling that whatever those sweets contained, it was not just sugar. He told himself firmly that he was not going to get involved. That was absolutely the last thing he wanted to do. Besides, surely the hero of the story would not fall for something so obvious. Then the girl cried out in alarm. Mazel had grabbed his own head and looked like he was struggling. His face had gone completely pale. Werner stared in disbelief. Mazel had actually eaten one. Werner immediately scanned the room, looking for the people who usually kept watch over Mazel. The other students in the room had already started whispering among themselves, unsure of what was happening. In Werner's head, the way things were supposed to work was simple. When something went wrong with the hero, it was the bodyguard's job to spring into action first. Mazel was the main character of this story. It should have been a given that he would be fine. The students around Mazel had already crowded in, checking on him with worried faces. But Werner was not so sure it was as simple as that. There was no real guarantee that things would play out exactly the way the game had. And the hard truth was that Mazel was the only one who could ever face the Demon Lord. That meant Werner needed Mazel to be in one piece and ready to play that role when the time came. Werner walked over and checked on Mazel himself. After a quick look, he could tell that Mazel's pulse and breathing were both steady. The school nurse would be able to handle things from here. The girl looked startled by Werner's sudden involvement. Werner calmly but firmly told her that the little gathering was over for the day and that Mazel needed to be looked after right away. The girl pushed back, saying that Mazel had become ill after eating something from her country, and that she personally wanted to take responsibility by bringing in a proper doctor to examine him. Werner cut her off before she could go any further. He pointed out that moving Mazel in a carriage while he was in this condition would not be safe, and that there was no way to be certain yet whether her sweets were even the cause. He added, with a smooth and polite tone, that even if they were, he would never want to place the kind of burden on her shoulders. It would be best, he said, to leave Mazel in the care of the school nurse first. The girl and the people around her fixed Werner with cold, sharp looks as he helped Mazel to his feet and slowly steered him away from the group. Werner thought to himself that if looks could actually do damage, he would have been dead on the spot. But regardless, he had the main character safe and out of harm's way. From the way everything had unfolded, Werner was fairly sure this had been a kidnapping attempt. Now the question was what to do about it going forward. Later, at the school clinic, Werner's patience had run out by the time Mazel's bodyguards finally showed up. He tore into them immediately, wanting to know how they could have left Mazel so open and unguarded, and what on earth they had been thinking by arriving so late when protecting Mazel was their entire job. One of the bodyguards shuffled awkwardly while the other explained that the person entertaining Mazel had been an exchange student of noble rank, the daughter of a duke, and so they had thought it necessary to tread carefully and be respectful of that. Werner could not believe what he was hearing. These men had been fully aware of the risks and had still chosen to leave Mazel alone because of social politics. He found it hard to understand how anyone could be that careless. Werner wasted no time giving them their instructions. He told one of them to go and report what had happened to a teacher, and the other to go and keep a close watch on the girl and her companions. Werner himself would stay behind and keep watch over Mazel. The bodyguard started to object, but Werner shut it down immediately with a sharp look and a firm tone. They straightened up at once and hurried off to do as they were told. Werner pulled back the curtain. Mazel was still unconscious on the bed. Werner stood there thinking about what a mess the whole situation had been. If he had only known ahead of time, he would have warned Mazel before the poison ever reached him. The world was still at peace at this point in the story. Because of that, most people did not see much worth in a hero right now. But Werner was troubled. He found himself wondering whether Mazel was truly going to be ready for everything that lay ahead. If someone was willing to target Mazel now, while things were still calm, then it stood to reason that similar attempts could happen again later. And if the hero kept getting pulled off course like this, the entire journey that was supposed to follow the Demon Lord's return could end up falling apart before it even began. Werner sat with that thought and quietly accepted what it meant. Then Mazel stirred and woke up, confused about where he was. Werner was relieved to see him conscious and let him know right away that he had been poisoned. He explained that things might feel a bit unclear for a while, but that the antidote had already been given and should be taking effect soon. He handed Mazel some water and told him to rest and take it slow. Mazel was shocked to hear the word poison and immediately asked whether the girl who had given him the sweets was all right, pointing out that she had eaten them too. Werner told him she was perfectly fine. She had quietly drunk an antidote just before Mazel had walked up to join her. Mazel struggled to accept that someone would do something like that inside the school. Werner told him plainly that yes, they absolutely would. He laid out what would have happened if he had not stepped in. The girl would have had Mazel taken to her embassy after he collapsed. He would have woken up the next morning with no memory of how he got there, with the girl beside him, and the whole thing would have been used to force a marriage at the point of a sword. A commoner spending the night with a duke's daughter would have caused a massive scandal. Mazel likely would have been shipped off to Salzanak before the day was even over. Mazel went completely quiet as he took that in. Werner added that people of noble rank had no trouble going to those kinds of lengths, and that Mazel needed to be more careful going forward. After a moment, Mazel smiled, and then he started to laugh softly. Werner wanted to know what was funny. Mazel said it was nothing, really. He just found it a little amusing that the person who had said all of that was himself a member of the aristocracy. Then Mazel mentioned that of course he knew who Werner was, since they were in the same class, and that he had actually been hoping for a chance to talk with Werner for a while now. Werner brushed it off and told Mazel he still did not look well and should lie back down. Mazel did as he was told. Werner thought quietly to himself that Mazel was talking and moving well enough. He figured that was just one of those things that came with being the main character of the story. Mazel looked puzzled by whatever Werner had muttered, but before anything more could be said, the door to the clinic swung open. Werner looked toward the entrance. A group of people had walked in. One of them told Werner flatly to clear out because they were taking the room. Werner studied them carefully. He told them, as calmly as he could manage, that there was a student resting inside and asked them to keep things quiet. The one who had spoken got angry fast and demanded to know who Werner thought he was, talking like that to someone older than him. Werner read the situation immediately. It did not matter what words he used. These people were not here to talk. They were looking for a reason to start something. And looking at the size of the man in front of him, he did not carry himself like a student at all. Werner's mind started working through the possibilities. They could be hired adventurers, the kind who would leave no trail. Or maybe a loyal, tight-lipped knight who would never say a word about who sent him. Either way, Werner had a feeling the plan was to rough him up, take Mazel, and then claim it was all being handled under the responsibility of their country. Werner did not wait any longer. He struck the man hard across the face. A spear was already in his hand. The man hit the floor with a heavy thud. Werner brought the spear down against the floor with a sharp crack and held his position. In his head, things were clear. If he was going to protect the hero, he was going to have to treat this exactly like he was dealing with intruders. And that meant he was going to have to fight every single one of them. They had more bodies and more muscle on their side. But Werner had already made up his mind. Werner told himself that he just needed to hold out long enough for a teacher to hear the noise and come running. But before he even had to test that plan, Mazel launched himself off the bed and flew in with a kick that caught one of the men completely off guard. The light-hearted, easygoing Mazel from earlier was nowhere to be seen. His face was calm and focused and serious. Werner watched as Mazel landed and immediately went after the next man. The sight of it made the others hesitate. Something in Mazel's eyes stopped them cold. But Mazel did not give them time to recover. He moved through them one after another, striking fast and with clear purpose. He took one man and shoved him into another, sending them both off balance. The first man who had gone down earlier tried to drag himself back up off the floor, but Mazel put a stop to that without a second thought. Werner stood there watching the whole thing unfold with genuine amazement. He thought to himself that it was something else entirely. Heroes really were on a completely different level. When the last of the men had been put down, Mazel turned around and asked Werner with an eager, upbeat energy whether he had come out of it all right. Werner told him he was fine, thanks to Mazel stepping in, and then turned it around and asked how Mazel himself was holding up after jumping into a fight in the state he was in. Mazel answered cheerfully that his hands had gone a little numb, but that he was perfectly okay. Werner could barely believe it. That had been Mazel running on weakened legs and a body, still fighting off poison, and he had still handled every single one of those men. Werner admitted to himself that things had been looking pretty rough for a moment there, and that he was genuinely grateful Mazel had jumped in when he did. Now, the next step was to get the teachers involved, hand things off to them, and let them take it from there. Once that was done, Werner would be able to breathe again. As if on cue, a voice came from the doorway. A teacher had arrived and took one look at the bodies on the floor before demanding to know what had happened. Mazel stumbled over his words. Werner thought privately that the timing could not have been better. He stepped forward and told the teacher he would explain everything properly in a moment, but that the men currently sprawled out on the clinic floor were likely not students at the school at all. The teacher looked alarmed. Werner laid out the basics, keeping his tone steady and almost pleasant about it. He and Mazel had been attacked by those men, and it appeared someone had sent them on purpose. As for exactly what they had been after, Werner said he still did not know for certain. And so he suggested with a cheerful manner that the teacher might want to get some answers out of the men themselves once they regained consciousness. The teacher wasted no time and called out to the students hovering behind him, sending them off immediately to bring the other teachers. They scattered in a hurry. Werner thought quietly to himself that from here, he could let the adults deal with the rest of it. In the end, Mazel's bodyguards took the blame for what had happened and lost their positions because of it. Afterward, Werner was asked to step in and take their place. He turned it down without hesitation, but things did not go back to the way they were before. Mazel had gotten comfortable around Werner after everything that had happened, and that was something Werner had not planned for at all. One day, while Werner was deep in a book, Mazel came over and said he wanted to ask Werner something. Werner would never have imagined that a single afternoon in the clinic would end with the hero becoming attached to him. Mazel wanted help understanding the proper manners expected at an upcoming ceremony. Werner thought it through. He could not exactly say no, not after everything Mazel had done, and he definitely could not afford to let another messy situation like the one with the girl happen again. So he pushed down his reluctance and helped, telling himself it was just to keep things on track and make sure the story moved the way it was supposed to. But then one thing led to another, and before Werner even noticed how it had happened, the two of them had been through enough together that they had become the closest of friends. They found their own comfortable rhythm and enjoyed their days at the academy together in a way that felt natural and easy. And then, without warning, the beginning of the game finally arrived. The world shifted. A stampede of demons broke the peace and drew back the curtain on the story that had always been coming. Through the battles that followed, the ones Werner and Mazel fought side by side, through every step of the way, Werner had said something to Mazel that he meant with everything in him. He had told him plainly that if saving the world somehow meant losing Mazel, then Werner would find a way to change the world itself before he let that happen. This was the legend of a hero that people would go on telling for generations. And it was also the story of his best friend. Werner had been a perfectly ordinary office worker in his previous life, until the day he woke up as a child inside the world of a video game he had once played. It was a classic RPG, the kind where a brave hero rises up and defeats a demon lord. But as Werner slowly pieced together his scattered memories, a serious problem came to light. He had not been reborn as anyone important. He was a nameless, faceless background character, the kind that nobody in the story ever notices, and that kind of person was destined to die in a massive, widespread slaughter that happened partway through the game's story. He was not going to pretend that sat well with him. That was not how he wanted things to end. The one thing working in his favor was that he had woken up before the events of the game had even begun. If he already knew how everything was going to play out, then he had a real chance of steering clear of the worst of it. He threw himself into training and preparation with everything he had, driven entirely by the desire to keep himself alive. But somewhere along the way, without meaning to, he ended up earning the deep respect and admiration of Mazel, the hero of the game and its central character. Werner had done his best at first to stay away from Mazel, worried that getting too close might accidentally change the course of events. But despite his best efforts, the two of them ended up becoming the closest of friends. The problem was that Mazel had a talent for landing himself in trouble. He was as unaware of danger as a person could possibly be, and he had a certain carelessness about him that made it hard to fully rely on him. The game had not even officially started yet, and Mazel was already putting himself at risk. That kept Werner on edge, quietly anxious about how things were going to unfold. It did not take Werner long to figure out that keeping his distance from Mazel was actually the worst thing he could do. At some point, he had made it clear to Mazel that if anything ever seemed off or suspicious, Mazel should come to him right away. Werner had made up his mind. He was going to stand behind the hero and support him all the way through until the demon lord was defeated. Then the demon stampede was brought up. A teacher explained to the students that a demon stampede was a massive surge of demons that broke out roughly every 20 years. The school would be playing a part in helping to push it back. Werner felt his nerves kick in at the announcement. After all the waiting, the game's first major event had finally arrived, and now that it was actually here, he found himself tense with anxiety. The teacher continued, explaining that if a demon stampede was left unchecked, the demons would tear through towns and villages in huge numbers. However, if handled quickly and decisively, they were not considered an overwhelming threat. Werner thought quietly to himself that under normal circumstances, that would be true. But this particular stampede was not normal. This was the opening scene of the game. Because of the demon lord's revival stirring beneath the surface, the demons this time around were going to be far more numerous and far stronger than anyone was prepared for. The capital's knights were going to be wiped out. The heir to the throne was going to die. It was going to be a disaster on a scale that nobody saw coming. The teacher went on to divide the students by background. Those from families of rank would return to their homes in the capital and wait for further orders. Those without noble rank would join the support teams, helping with transport and caring for the wounded. They probably would not end up in direct combat, the teacher said, but they should still keep their guard up. The students of common background gave their agreement. Werner turned the situation over in his mind. Mazel would most likely end up protecting the other students in his group. Meanwhile, the knights at the front line were going to be destroyed, and since Werner would be fighting alongside them, there was a very real chance he would die there too. To stop that from happening, he needed to start preparing immediately. He had to build up their fighting strength and come up with a solid plan. His thoughts were broken by Mazel's voice cutting sharply through the air, calling out his name. Werner snapped back to the present. Mazel wanted to know what was going on, pointing out that break time had come and Werner had not moved a single muscle. Werner realized he had gotten completely lost in his own head. He pulled himself together, stood up, and told Mazel he was heading home. Mazel looked confused and reminded him that they had planned to go check out daggers at the weapon shop that day. Werner apologized and explained that he needed to spend his time getting ready for the battle, things like finding reliable people to fight alongside him. The weapon shop would have to wait for another time. Mazel asked whether all of that was really necessary for a demon stampede, suggesting it might be going a bit far. Werner told him plainly that there was no way to know for certain that things would go the usual way this time. Mazel said easily that he would just follow Werner's lead the way he always did. Werner had to stop him there and explain that he could not do that this time because they were not going to be in the same group. His family had rank, which meant they would be separated. Mazel's energy dropped visibly at that. His whole demeanor shifted and he looked genuinely sad about it. Werner looked at him and thought to himself that Mazel's reaction was almost like that of a dog being told it could not come along. Werner reached over and patted him, telling him to just do what he normally did, stay alert, and he would be perfectly fine. What Werner kept to himself was the truth of what was actually going to happen. In the game, this battle ended with Mazel tracking down and defeating the demon who had been behind everything. It would be a turning point for Mazel. His courage and skill would be recognized, and from that moment on people would begin to know him as the hero who had stepped forward when it mattered most. But Werner still reminded Mazel to stock up on as many recovery potions as he could carry and to make sure his armor was in order. Mazel responded in a teasing way, comparing Werner to a worried parent. Werner told him that if everything went well, Mazel would not even need to touch a single potion. Then a classmate appeared and asked nervously what he was supposed to do. Werner told him to follow the teacher's instructions. The classmate admitted that he had never been in a real battle before and was frightened. Before Werner could say anything more, Mazel jumped in. He pointed out that their classmate Kranich was skilled with a bow, so he should bring that. Mazel figured Kranich would probably be assigned to the support squad as a guard. Kranich asked with some surprise whether Mazel really thought so. Then a female classmate came over and asked the same question, wanting to know what she should do. Mazel told her that since Kalina was a mage, she would likely be put to work helping the injured, and that it would be smart to prepare some protective gear just to be safe. Werner stood back and watched as more and more students made their way over to Mazel, each one looking for guidance and reassurance about what they should do. Werner found himself quietly amazed. There was no way Mazel had sat down and memorized every single person's abilities. And yet somehow he knew. Some of the students asking him were not even from their class. Mazel's memory continued to leave Werner at a loss for words. This world ran on a skill system much like the ones found in video games. Werner had earned the skill of spearmanship through relentless, grinding practice over a long period of time. Mazel's skill was something called heroism. It was a straightforward name, almost too on the nose, but what it actually meant was staggering. With that one skill, Mazel was capable of mastering any combat ability that existed. To put in plain terms, whatever Werner had spent years working himself to the bone to learn, Mazel could watch once and immediately replicate it with full mastery. It was, in every sense, an ability that broke the rules. The first time Werner had witnessed it with his own eyes, he had actually cried. This Demon Stampede event was essentially built to give Mazel his first real taste of genuine combat, and to let him push his abilities to their limit in a real situation. It was his moment, but Werner had his own survival to worry about on his side of things. He reminded Mazel one more time not to forget the recovery potions before heading off to start his preparations. Mazel said he understood. The two of them bumped fists. Werner told himself that he just had to do whatever was within his power to do. He would figure the rest out from there. Later, Werner found himself asking whether his father would be present at the battle. Norbert, the Zerfield family's butler, confirmed that he would not. Werner's father would be elsewhere, attending to the king. That news hit Werner hard. His chances of surviving had just dropped considerably. Though when he thought about it, it made sense. His father was a count and a minister of the state. There was simply no reason for someone in that position to be placed anywhere near a battlefield. Norbert went on to explain that because of this, Werner would officially carry the title of commander over the count's troops in name. Werner complained that it made no sense to put a student in that role. Norbert reassured him that in reality, it would be Commander Max Lyman doing the actual leading. The count's family, Norbert explained, would essentially just be there for appearances. Werner turned that over in his mind. That reasoning would hold up perfectly well if this were just the usual small-scale demon stampede. But it was not. He told Norbert to bring Max to him, and also to handle the shopping and the hiring of additional soldiers. Norbert looked surprised by the request. Werner thought to himself that he had no idea how much he could actually pull off, but his life was on the line. Holding back was not an option. By the time everything was arranged, the total number of foot soldiers came to 4,200 men, along with 200 mercenaries and 100 students there to provide support. Werner thought about how the others likely had not even entertained the idea of losing this battle. For them, this was already a large force to bring together for something like this. A voice came from behind Werner. It was Max Lyman, commander of the Zerfield soldiers, remarking that having this many men for a battle of this size felt like they were going overboard. Werner privately agreed that was a fair observation. For experienced soldiers like these, a demon stampede was about as threatening as a casual outing. As a civil servant family, the Zerfields typically showed up to these things with 4 or 5 people, including Max. But this time Werner had pulled together around 100 men. To anyone used to the routine kind of demon stampede, the whole thing must have looked wildly excessive. Werner wished, not for the first time, that they could feel even a fraction of the danger he knew was coming. There was no way to make them understand. So he was simply grateful they were going along with it without too much resistance. He was in no position to demand more than that. The first platoon commander Orjan remarked that for the royal grandson's first battle, things were shaping up to be a bit dull. Werner agreed out loud. Inside his head, he was thinking about the two supreme commanders of this battle, the crown prince and his son, referred to as the royal grandson. Both of them were in line to inherit the throne, and in the game, both of them were meant to die in this very battle. Their deaths, combined with the destruction of the knights, would be what set off the chain of events that pushed the hero into one adventure after another. Werner would much rather keep them alive and avoid all of that unfolding around him, though he was not sure how realistic that hope was. Max leaned in quietly and suggested that Werner might want to take the chance to go and greet Count first while they had the opportunity, since the first family commanded the neighboring army. Werner's face fell at the suggestion. The Zerfield family were civil servants by nature, while the first family were military people through and through. Their lands bordered each other, and since their strengths lay in different areas, the two families had always maintained a reasonably friendly relationship built on cooperation. Werner let out a sigh and agreed to go, but asked Max to come along with him. He left Origin in charge while they were away, and Origin confirmed it without hesitation. When they stood before Count Bastian Timo first, the Count acknowledged Werner as the son of Minister Zerfield. Werner introduced himself formally and apologized for not having done so sooner. First then looked past Werner to Max and addressed him by name, expressing confidence that Max would serve the minister's son well. Max responded respectfully and thanked the Count for his consideration. Werner noticed all of this quietly. First had used Max's name, but had only referred to Werner as the minister's son, even after Werner had introduced himself. Werner thought dryly about whether he was even visible to the man. He was not particularly offended. Military people tended to look down on civil servants, and it was not necessarily done out of cruelty. In First's eyes, Max was the one actually running the battle, which naturally made Max the more worthwhile person to address. Then someone else stepped into the conversation. It was Tyrone, the son and heir of the First family. Tyrone made a suggestion, framed as a generous offer, that his father simply take command of Werner's forces as well. Max stumbled over his words slightly. Werner kept his reaction carefully neutral inside. There was no way that was ever going to happen. What Tyrone was really saying, without meaning it as an insult, was that Werner was not cut out for this, and that they should just let the people who knew what they were doing handle it. In Tyrone's mind, that was probably the kindest and most helpful thing he could offer. The social order of this world made the thinking behind it clear enough. The royal family sat at the very top, followed by military aristocrats, then civil servants, then the broader nobility, and then everyone else below that. That gap in standing between the First family and the Zerfield family was obvious and uncomfortable to be around. This was exactly why Werner had not wanted to come in the first place. Footsteps approached, and a woman appeared. It was the second daughter of the First family, Hermine, if Werner was remembering the name correctly. She stepped in and gently pointed out to her brother that what he had suggested simply was not possible. Tyrone acknowledged it. Hermine then turned and addressed Werner herself, saying she had heard he was still a student and that it would be best if he stayed behind their forces and did not push himself too hard. Werner smiled at her and offered his thanks, but inside he felt like he had just been quietly stabbed. Count First added his own version of the same sentiment, telling Werner not to overdo things and to pull back without hesitation if he ever felt he was in danger. Werner read the whole exchange for what it was. The First family had never had any real intention of taking him seriously. He thanked them, told them he should be getting back to his men. Werner kept his expression pleasant until they were out of earshot, but inside he was utterly drained and wanted nothing more than to be done with the whole visit, and then he and Max walked away. Behind them, Hermine quietly told her brother that she was not entirely sure his earlier remark had been the right thing to say. Tyrone admitted she had a point. The two of them and their father watched Werner and Max walk away. First said that Lord Werner was known at the academy as a serious and capable student, and that he was not simply the son of a count to be dismissed so easily. Tyrone said that he too had heard the talk, including the fact that Werner was the only member of his household with any real combat ability. But even granting that, Tyrone felt it was still somewhat limited. Werner's ranking was first in spearmanship alone, and when it came to being a true knight, everyone knew that the sword was what mattered above all else. Spearmanship was a perfectly reasonable starting point for a young knight working his way up, but that did not stop someone from raising a very practical concern. If Lord Werner were to get himself killed in battle, there would be no one left to inherit the Zerfield land. Hermine said as much and called out to Tyrone about it. At the Zerfield military camp, Werner stood in front of his assembled men. Both Werner and Max looked like they had already been through something exhausting, worn out before the fighting had even begun. Werner told his men he was going to run through the strategy one more time. One of his men noticed the state the two of them were in and asked, with a hint of suspicion, whether something had happened during their visit with the First, since the battle had not even started yet, and they already looked like that. Werner denied it. The men brushed past it and got themselves fired up, calling out that they were going to show that old soldier what they were made of. Another voice chimed in full of confidence, saying victory was certain and that they would all be coming home with medals to show for it. The camp filled with cheering. Werner tried to pull them back, telling them that was not the point of any of this. The second platoon commander, Barkey, noted that considering Werner had only pulled this group of men together the day before, they were showing a surprisingly solid level of discipline. Origin agreed, remarking that it really was an impressive collection of trained soldiers gathered in one place. Werner ran through the structure in his head. The way he had arranged things, every 5 men formed a squad with one of them leading it. There were 18 squads in total, divided across 3 platoons. On top of that, Werner had a hunter unit that answered directly to him. As long as the orders from the top could reach the hunter unit and the 3 platoon leaders, those orders could then be passed down quickly and clearly to everyone else. Werner turned back to his men and told them firmly that in battle, no one was to try and stand out on their own. Everything was to be done as a group, not just moving together, but fighting together. No one was to take on a demon by themselves. There was some restless shifting among the men at that. Werner acknowledged it. He told them he understood that this might only be a demon stampede, but that he had no intention of coming out of it with losses that did not need to happen. He made it plain. There would be no unnecessary sacrifices. That was the one goal he was setting for the Count's forces in this fight. Even as he said it, he knew deep down that keeping that promise perfectly Werner was not going to be easy. The battle against the demon forces was going to drag on for a stretch of time, and it would not be over until Mazel tracked down and defeated the one driving everything from behind the scenes. Until that happened, Werner's first and most pressing job was simply to stay alive. Across the way, where Mazel had gathered with his own group, one of the people around him commented on just how many recovery potions he had brought with him. Mazel laughed it off lightly. The woman standing beside him remarked that for someone as powerful as he was surprisingly careful about things like that. Someone else in the group jokingly said that if they got hurt, they were counting on Mazel to sort them out. Their leader cut the chatter short and told everyone to get into their groups and focus. In Mazel's head, the reason for the potions was simple. Werner had told him to bring as many as he could carry, so that was exactly what he had done. Mazel thought back to how Werner had stressed it. He had long since learned that when Werner said something that sounded strange or over the top, there was almost always a real reason behind it, even if Werner did not explain what it was. As Mazel settled into his position and the moment drew closer, he found himself wondering quietly what Werner was doing right now. Werner made his position clear to his men. Above everything else, he wanted to keep the number of casualties as low as possible. He reminded them of the core rule he had set. Every demon was to be taken on in groups of 5, and no one was ever to fight alone. They were currently holding the left flank position at the Count Zerfield military camp. Once a demon was brought down, the group that finished it off was to immediately move and help whatever team was nearest to them, then repeat that process over and over again. A voice pushed back against the plan. Werner looked up and saw that it was Barkey, the 2nd platoon commander, expressing his disagreement. Standing beside him was Orjan, the 1st platoon commander. Werner held his ground and explained that demons did not fight one-on-one to begin with, and that there was absolutely nothing to be gained by showing off knightly honor in a situation like this. The knights reacted with clear dissatisfaction. Werner understood it. In a world that placed a high value on personal bravery and individual strength in battle, a strategy built around ganging up on enemies in groups probably felt to them like an insult to their abilities and their pride. But that kind of thinking was not going to serve them here. So Werner shifted the framing entirely. He pointed out that this was the royal grandson's very first battle, and that there was no reason for any of them to go out of their way to steal the spotlight from His Highness. The knights accepted that reasoning without argument. Werner allowed himself a small grin. He then laid out the practical side of things. The scale of the demon stampede was still unknown, and in a large outbreak, enemies kept coming no matter how many were cut down. It was entirely possible the fighting could drag on for the whole day. No soldier could maintain peak fighting condition through something like that. Barkey admitted that even weak enemies in enormous numbers would chip away at stamina over time, and that if they were all exhausted and found themselves surrounded, casualties would be unavoidable. Werner confirmed that was exactly the thinking. Minimizing losses while still holding the line was the goal, and the group strategy was the best way to get there. He also told them to hold something back in reserve, so that if the worst happened, they would still have enough left to go and support the other families fighting nearby. The knights were surprised to hear that, but agreed to it. Orjan laughed and put in a request that if that moment came, his platoon be the ones sent over to the first household. Werner said that sounded fine. Barkey pointed out with some amusement that the only reason Orjan wanted to go was because he had his eye on the first daughter and could not stop chasing after women. Orjan reacted with embarrassed protest, and the group burst into laughter. Werner said in that case Barkey could be the one to go instead, which only made everyone laugh harder. Werner watched them and thought to himself that the knights seemed to be treating this all a bit too lightly. He could not really blame them for it, though. Barkey and Orjan kept bickering playfully between themselves while Max, standing behind Werner, noted quietly that they should probably start getting ready themselves. Werner brought the mood back to focus, told them the talking was done, and sent everyone back to their positions. The knights moved to comply. Werner felt at the moment it shifted. The air turned cold and tense, just as he had expected it would. The battle began shortly after they had confirmed their plan, and within a few hours, the demons were flooding in. Everything unfolded in line with what the game had laid out. The knights struggled hard under the pressure. Any unit that pushed too far ahead or tried to stand out on its own was crushed, and the bodies of the fallen began to stack up. Soldiers broke and ran one after another, unable to hold themselves together in the chaos. But within the Zerfield forces, the word had been passed, and the men were following it. They were coordinating with the teams beside them, pulling back their injured and keeping the formation from falling apart. Orjan checked on his men mid-fight, directing those who were hurt to pull back and get treated while the rest pressed forward. Werner called out to the retreating squads to fold in behind the forward squads as they regrouped, keeping the line moving and organized. The Zerfield forces kept their shape even as everything around them was coming apart, steadily moving their wounded away from the front. Werner's body was beginning to find a rhythm. For every demon he cut down, another one took its place. There was no time to think and barely enough time to breathe, let alone wipe the blood from his face. But his body moved on its own, the years of grinding training taking over where his mind could not keep up. He pushed forward and called out to his men not to advance too far and to keep their eyes open. He was breathing hard. He told himself that he was just grateful everyone was sticking to the plan. If they could hold this line until Mazel dealt with the one pulling the strings behind the stampede, they would make it through. Then a voice cried out in the middle of the fighting, calling desperately for help. There were too many soldiers breaking and running, and the number of deserters was growing. Werner thought about what he could actually do about it. In the grand picture, the Zerfield forces were not the ones turning the tide of this battle. They had a solid number of men for a civil servant family, but in terms of the overall fight, they were a small piece of the whole. To the right were the Royal Elite Knights, one of the most powerful forces on the field. To the left were the forces of Count First, a family built entirely around military strength. The Zerfield forces were positioned in a way that kept them sheltered between those two larger powers. But if either of those flanks gave way, the Zerfield forces would be fighting for their lives with nothing to protect them. Werner knew that as a commander, and frankly as someone who very much wanted to survive this day, he could not allow either of those two forces to collapse. Sending reinforcements was an option, but the First family carried the pride of a military household. If Werner misjudged the timing and offered help too soon, they would reject it outright. The timing would have to be exactly right. Across the field, Max was shouting at the men to use the bodies of the fallen as shields. Werner called over to Max and asked how things were looking on his side. Max reported that his section was holding, but the forces of the other noble families that had pushed forward into the demons were now being driven back. Those retreating forces were pressing inward, and the Zerfield army was starting to get squeezed in from the sides. The families that had already fallen back and joined them had been brought together and reorganized into the larger force. Werner took that in and understood what it meant for the shape of the battle. Then a scream tore through the noise around them, raw and filled with pain. It came from a knight nearby. Werner tightened his grip on his weapon and cut into the monster that was on top of the man. He sent his soldiers rushing at the creature and moved in to check on the knight himself. The knight was shaken and struggling to speak, but managed to get out a word of thanks. Werner recognized the armor. The knight was from Count First's unit. Werner asked what had happened to the rest of the knight's group. The knight trembled and said that he did not know. That one moment everything had been fine, and the next he had been fighting for his life. Werner understood. He told his men to tend to the knight first and get him patched up before anything else. Werner took stock of the situation around him. It was not just the slave soldiers who were struggling. Even the well-equipped knights were being pushed to their limits. He turned the question over in his head, weighing whether to send reinforcements now or hold a little longer. Then he made his decision. He did not want to thin out his own company's strength over a hesitation call. He called for Barkey and told him that as soon as he was ready, he was to take his platoon over to support Count First's unit. Werner thought to himself that they needed to regroup now, while there were still people standing who could fight. Over on the right flank, Count First's forces were in the middle of a brutal struggle. Count First drove his men forward with his voice, urging them not to break, telling them these were nothing but weak enemies. But even as he fought, something was nagging at him. This demon stampede did not feel right. The demons were behaving differently from anything he had seen before. Many of his men, knights and slave soldiers alike, had been seized by fear and were no longer of any real use in the fight. First found himself spending as much energy trying to stop his own soldiers from running as he did fighting the enemy. He called out, wanting to know where his son Tyrone and his daughter Hermine had gone. A soldier reported that both had gone forward to support the front line and had not been seen since. First went still for a moment, then gave the order for his men to stop pressing into the enemy and pull together. They needed to regroup. Not far away, Hermine had heard her father's voice carrying over the chaos but could not make out the words. She looked around and realized she had been cut off from everyone else. She kept fighting the monsters closing in on her, but her mind told her clearly that this was dangerous and that she needed to find her way back. Then she heard a grunt of pain nearby and recognized her brother's voice. She moved to him immediately and helped him drive back the monster that had him pinned. She asked if he was all right. They did not have time to say much. They exchanged quick words, agreeing they had to get back to their father and find out what orders he had for them. They kept talking while their weapons kept moving, cutting down the demons that kept pressing in. In her head, Hermine was troubled. They were superior fighters with better armor than most on this field, and yet the best they could manage was avoiding wounds serious enough to kill them outright. She called out to the other knights around her to send for backup. Then another cry for help came, this one more desperate than the last. By the time anyone could react, a soldier had been caught in the jaws of a monster and was torn apart right in front of them. Hermine clenched her teeth. She gave the order to anyone still able to stand to get behind her, and for the others to gather up the fallen as they pushed their way back toward her father. One of the female knights asked how they were supposed to do that when the demons were as thick as ever. Another monster snarled and lunged. Hermine told them not to be afraid and to stay close together. She pushed the words out with confidence, but inside, she was asking herself the same question. She did not know how either, but she knew that if they stopped moving, this battlefield was where they would all die. She had one thought driving her forward: cut through the enemy numbers, keep cutting, and get back to her father. Reduce them, keep reducing them, and move. Then a demon beast caught her in its jaws. Its drool dripped across her face. She was staring straight into the mouth of it, certain that was the end. Then a blade came from nowhere and split the creature clean in half. Blood sprayed across her face. A voice cut through the noise, firm and controlled, telling the troops not to push themselves too hard and calling out to maintain their positions. Amin had no idea who these people were or where they had come from. Her legs gave out beneath her, and she felt herself caught before she hit the ground. It was Barky. He steadied her and asked if she was all right, recognizing her as the daughter of Count First. Hermine thanked him and asked who he was. Barky apologized for not introducing himself sooner and told her he was Barky of the Zerfield unit, sent to provide assistance on Lord Werner's orders. Hermine could barely believe what she was hearing. The Zerfield family. Of all the forces on this field, she looked at what had just happened, from the attack that had pulled the monster off her to the organized support that had arrived with him, and the contrast was hard to ignore. Their own warrior household had been pushed to the edge while the Zerfield forces had somehow held themselves together and come out with something to spare. She asked, with quiet amazement, whether this had all been the doing of the sun. Barky confirmed it without hesitation, saying that everything had been done under Lord Werner's command. Hermine let that sink in. Barky went on to explain that the wounded units from the other noble families were already pulling back and regrouping behind their lines. He asked, as respectfully as he could, whether Hermine might advise Count First to take advantage of the opportunity and pull his forces back as well, at least for the time being. Hermine thought about how her father and her brother would likely feel about accepting help from the Zerfield family. It would sting their pride, but she also recognized this for what it was. It was the difference between defeat and survival, maybe even victory. She thanked Barky and told him she would go to her father immediately. Back at the left flank of the Zerfield forces, word came in that Count First troops would be joining them as well. Max reported that the noble family armies that had regrouped with them earlier were steadily returning to the battlefield. Werner acknowledged it as good news. He thought quietly to himself about the bigger picture. The only reason they had not been completely wiped out through all of this was that the bulk of what they were fighting was still the weaker end of what the demon forces could throw at them. If things ended now, the Order of Knights might not be entirely destroyed, which meant there might still be something worse waiting. He pushed that thought aside and focused on one hope. He just needed Mazel to get to the demon behind everything before that something worse arrived. What bothered Werner was that the game had never told him clearly how the Knights fared through all of this. There had been no information on that part in what he remembered. Then a shout came from somewhere behind him. One of his soldiers was crying out that they had won. That victory was theirs. Werner's head snapped up. His men were reacting with disbelief and relief, saying that the enemy was pulling back and that holding out had paid off. Werner stood there, turning it over in his mind. They had won. Had Mazel already dealt with the demon mastermind, just as the game story had laid out? But in the game, that moment had not come until after the entire Order of Knights had been wiped out. The timing was completely off from what he remembered. Something was not adding up. There had to be more to it. Werner made up his mind fast. He called for Max and gave the order for the troops to assemble. He told Max to make sure the recovery potions from the rear unit supplies were distributed to the injured. Max started to object, but Werner cut him off and said it did not matter, that they needed to move and be ready. Because Werner was going to the main army. He was going to the Royal Prince. The soldiers were celebrating loudly, declaring that the victory belonged to them. Someone remarked that it had been a hard fight, but that the Royal Knights had proven themselves. Max noted with genuine admiration that it was thanks to Werner that their unit had come through with so few losses. He was about to bring up the order to pursue the retreating enemy when he realized Werner was not paying attention to any of it. Werner's mind was elsewhere entirely. Something about this felt wrong. None of it matched the game's story the way it should have. Max pointed out that the enemy was pulling back and pressed Werner for an order. Werner stopped him with a question. He needed to know whether the enemy was truly withdrawing in an organized way or simply scattering and fleeing in panic. Max confirmed it. They were moving toward the forest. Werner immediately gave Max the order to assemble the troops and make sure the injured got to the recovery potions stored at the rear units. Max began to object, but Werner told him plainly that this was a trap. Then Werner turned and headed toward the main army at a full run, leaving Max to carry out the orders. Werner pushed through the aftermath of the battle, his feet landing in pools of blood. The path ahead was narrow and treacherous, cluttered with bodies and slicked with the fluids of the fallen, both human and demon alike. Just staying upright took effort, and the smell of blood mixed with the thick stench of the insect-like demon remains hung heavily in the air. Every step demanded focus. He asked himself why he was sprinting at full speed through all of this, but he already knew the answer. He was the only one on this entire field who understood what was about to happen if no one stopped it. When he got close to the main army, a wall of night blades came up and blocked his path. He pushed to be let through, telling the guards he had something urgent to report to the Crown Prince. The Knights standing watch refused and told him to have the commander of the left flank deliver the report through proper channels. Werner's mind raced. If he let it go through those channels, by the time it reached anyone who mattered, it would be too late. Everything he had done today would amount to nothing. He had to get directly in front of the Crown Prince. But the guards were not moving. Then Werner heard voices among the nearby knights, talking casually. They were congratulating themselves on what had been achieved, talking about how the ringleader of the demons had been defeated, how frightening things had gotten for a while, but how all that was left now was cleaning up the stragglers. There was laughter in their voices. They believed the battle was over and won. Werner stood there trying to think of a way past the wall of guards when he heard another voice, this one younger and sharp with eagerness. It was the royal grandson, speaking to his father, the crown prince, asking for the order to pursue the fleeing demons. The crown prince gave his consent. Werner seized the moment and spoke out directly, calling to the prince and saying he had something urgent that needed to be heard. The prince turned and looked toward him. The knights around Werner reacted immediately with outrage, demanding to know how he dared address the prince without going through proper protocol. Someone identified him as a nobleman from the left flank and moved to remove him. But the prince held them back and gave the order to let Werner through. The guards stepped aside. The prince acknowledged that the left wing had taken the heaviest part of the fighting and that Werner must have come with something worth saying. He motioned for Werner to approach and speak. The prince asked who he was. Werner walked forward and went down on one knee before the prince. Werner introduced himself as being from Count Zerfield's household. The prince recognized him as the Minister of Ceremonies' son, remarking that Werner was young but clearly sharp. He asked Werner what he had to say. Werner let out a breath and then told the prince directly that he needed to order the troops to retreat. Murmuring broke out among the soldiers standing behind the prince. Werner had expected that reaction. They had just fought through a brutal and costly battle and come out on the other side. He could not fault them for the excitement they felt, but he also knew that what he knew and what he could prove to them were two very different things. Convincing them was not going to be simple. The soldiers were about to dismiss Werner entirely when the prince stopped them and asked Werner what was behind his reasoning. Werner was genuinely surprised that the prince was listening. He laid out his case. The behavior of the enemy was not normal. The demon believed to have been the leader had been defeated, yes, and it made sense on the surface that the rest would fall back as a result. But Werner pointed out that what was happening was not fleeing or scattering in panic. It was a coordinated withdrawal. Every last demon, including the insect creatures that operated on pure instinct with no sign of higher thinking, was moving in the same direction at the same time. Creatures like that did not simply choose to retreat on their own. The demons were not afraid. They were leading the knights somewhere. It was a trap designed to draw the army into the forest, where the bulk of the enemy's forces were bugs and beasts that moved freely and with a natural advantage in that environment, while the knights in their heavy armor would be at a severe disadvantage from the moment they stepped in. The prince did not waste another second. He gave the order immediately to sound the retreat and call the knights back. Everyone was to regroup right away with whatever personnel remained. His men were stunned, but the prince drove them into action and they moved quickly to carry out his orders. He then turned back to Werner and asked if there was anything else. Werner said there was, if he was permitted to speak freely. The prince allowed it. Werner suggested that the royal grandson might be best suited to taking up a position guarding the gates of the capital's castle. The prince agreed and gave the order for his men to assist his son Reuven and escort the injured soldiers and the supply unit northward to the Great Guard. Werner thought through the logic of it as the orders were carried out. Reuven was young, and Werner had no real confidence in his ability to hold his own in what was still to come. By framing the reassignment as an important duty rather than a removal from danger, Reuven could return to the capital with his dignity intact and without it costing them any additional soldiers to send him back safely. It was clean and it worked. The prince asked if that covered everything. Werner confirmed that it did. The prince then told Werner to return to his camp and bring his army to rejoin the central main forces when the regrouping was done. Werner was not entirely sure what to make of that. The prince told him plainly that he would be in touch once the deployment was sorted out, making it clear that Werner's usefulness to him was not finished yet. Werner felt a small smile cross his face and gave a respectful acknowledgement before turning to leave. When he made it back to his own camp, Max's voice hit him loud and immediate, wanting to know how everything had gone. Werner filled Max in on what had happened. He had managed to get word to the prince in time to stop the army from walking into the enemy's trap. Once the knights regrouped, they were going to launch a full assault. On top of that, the prince had given Werner a direct order to bring his troops in and unite them with the central forces. Max could barely contain his reaction. The idea that Werner had received a personal order from the crown prince himself was almost too much to take in. He immediately turned to start pulling everyone together, already talking about celebrating. Werner stopped him. This was not a moment for celebration. The fighting was nowhere near finished. Max pushed back, insisting that receiving a direct order from the crown prince was an enormous honor regardless of what came next. Werner reluctantly gave him that much. Before Werner could settle into the moment, one of his men called out that a visitor had arrived. Werner turned and saw Hermine standing there. He had not expected to see her and had no idea why she had come. Hermine apologized immediately for the interruption, acknowledging that coming to him this way was not the most proper thing to do, but said she had something she needed to speak with him about, and it could not wait. Werner explained that while he was sure there would be further instructions coming, they were under orders from the crown prince to move to the center ahead of the battle to come. Hermine looked caught off guard by that, and asked what he meant. Werner told her plainly that the enemy's withdrawal was a trap. She struggled to accept it, but said that if Werner was saying it, it had to be true, and that in fact it made it even more important that she had come to find him. Werner found himself at a loss again. Hermine straightened herself and first asked that Werner allow her to apologize for the way she and her family had spoken to him before the battle. She bowed her head and told him directly that if not for him, she would not be alive. Werner's eyes went wide. He thought back to their first meeting, how she had spoken to him then, and he genuinely did not know how to respond. Hermine pressed on. If Werner was saying the battle was going to continue, then she had a request. She asked him for advice on battle strategy for the units on the left flank that answered to the royal family. Werner looked at her face. It was completely serious. There was no trace of the tone she had carried before. He felt that turning her down was simply not an option and agreed to help. By the time they reached the center position ahead of the main camp, even a simple act of putting one foot in front of the other felt like it was costing him. Max told him to rest while they waited for orders from the prince. Then Max laughed warmly and remarked that on the way there, not just the First Forces but a whole string of others had sought Werner out for advice. It was enough to make even Max feel a little proud just by association. Werner said it had felt less like the First family as a whole and more like Hermine on her own. Max called him modest. He said Werner's advice had been solid across the board. Werner kept deflecting the praise. Max added that he had had no idea Werner had this kind of mind for strategy. Werner thought quietly to himself that all of it had come from borrowed knowledge carried over from his past life. He was not sure any of it was truly deserving of the kind of praise they were giving him. Then a knight arrived carrying orders from the crown prince. The knight announced that Lord Werner van Zerfield had been given authority to command the troops of the various noble units and was to take position on the right flank of the main body in preparation for the coming enemy attack. Werner accepted the order with a calm he did not entirely feel on the inside. He thought about what it actually meant. He was not just going to be fighting at the front. He was now responsible for commanding multiple units from different aristocratic families. His own troops broke into cheers around him, full of pride and excitement. Werner stood there thinking about what on earth the crown prince was thinking. Werner was a student. This was his first battle. It was an enormous amount to place on someone like him. Max and Barkey came to him, reading the look on his face, and acknowledged that anyone would be nervous in his position. But they pointed out that while everyone else had walked into this demon stampede, treating it as a minor inconvenience, Werner had been the only one who had kept a clear head, read the situation carefully, and acted on what he saw. Max added his own voice to it, saying that Werner should just keep doing what he had been doing, and there was nothing to worry about. The Zerfield troops would give everything they had to carry out his orders and back him up. They even noted that they still had plenty of potions to spare. Werner listened to all of it. He thought to himself that nervous was not quite the right word for what he was feeling. These people, his men and Hermine alike, were giving him far more credit than he deserved. Everything he had done came from knowing the outcome in advance and working backward from there. The strategies he had shared were things he had read in books. Whether any of them would actually hold up in the reality of a real battle was something he genuinely could not be certain of. If he was being honest with himself, the weight of all of this was a great deal to carry. He covered his face with his hands for a moment, then pulled himself together and thanked his men, telling them they were right. He pushed the heavier thoughts aside. The existential reckoning could wait until after he survived. For now, he just had to hold on until Mazel finished things on his end. He clenched his fist. Just a little longer, he told himself. First, he had to figure out the right formation for his troops. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he sent a quiet plea in Mazel's direction, hoping the hero would wrap this up quickly. Meanwhile, Mazel was in the thick of his own fight somewhere else on the field. One of the men under his command admitted with surprise that he had expected Mazel, being a student, to slow them down, but that Mazel had more than proven himself. Mazel thanked him by name. The man, Lugents, said the potions had been a real comfort too, and that they had already gone through quite a few of them. He admitted honestly that he had not expected that, and had initially thought Mazel was overdoing it by bringing so many. Someone else in the group asked why Mazel had brought such a large supply. Mazel explained simply that his friend Werner had told him to. He told the others a little about Werner, about how smart he was, and how many times he had stepped in and saved Mazel from one thing or another. He mentioned that he had been anxious when he had been assigned to the search party, but that Werner had told him to just do what he normally did, stay sharp, and he would be fine. His companions were surprised to hear that this friend Werner was also caught up in the demon stampede, and even more surprised to learn that Mazel was close friends with a nobleman. Mazel said yes, but that Werner was nothing like what people expected from someone of noble rank. He was not the least bit arrogant about it. One of the women in the group said it sounded terrible, noting that she had heard the main forces were struggling badly. Mazel went quiet for a moment. Then he said with calm certainty that Werner was fine. Werner was always prepared for whatever came. He had a way of doing things with a spear that seemed almost impossible, and he never lost his head no matter what the situation was. He always thought before he moved. The woman nodded. Lugents said they needed to find the enemy commander fast, if not for their own sake then for the sake of this friend of Mazel's as well. They were still moving and talking when something stopped them cold. Lugents told everyone to get down immediately. Mazel asked what it was. Lugents said quietly that it looked like they had found what they were looking for. A sound was approaching, heavy and deliberate, and then a voice came out of it, rough and female in tone. It said that the humans had actually made it this far. In the video game, the first major story event was the demon stampede. It was supposed to end with the knights being torn apart and the crown prince losing his life. It had been a brutal and bloody battle from beginning to end, and when the enemy pulled back, everyone had felt a surge of confidence. That confidence was exactly what the enemy had been counting on. The plan had been to use that feeling to draw the remaining knights into destruction. But because the crown prince had listened to Werner's warning, that fate had been avoided. The next wave, however, was almost certainly going to be a full and unrestrained assault. Werner asked for a status report. He was told that the units now under his command had already received their orders from the crown prince and were on the move. The prince had agreed to the battle strategy and troop formation Werner had proposed, and the units were expected to arrive shortly. Werner acknowledged the report and thanked the messenger. He was also told that the other units had already pulled back out of the danger zone, and that some of the injured were on their way to the capital along with the royal grandson Reuven, taking with them those who were too hurt to keep fighting. The name Reuven caught Werner off guard for just a moment before he placed it. That was the royal grandson. He had not known the name until now. The knight added that at present they were managing a careful retreat while keeping a close watch on the units surrounding the prince's entourage. Max said that it was because of Werner that they had avoided being completely overrun, and that he could not fully put into words how grateful he was that Werner had been there. Werner told him quietly that the hard part was only just beginning. In his mind, he was already thinking through what came next. While he had been repositioning to the right flank of the main unit, the crown prince had been moving quickly to get things organized. Now that the enemy's trap had failed, their next move would almost certainly be to abandon subtlety and throw everything they had at the army directly. The main unit was moving fast to prepare a retreat, but the crown prince himself was showing no sign of leaving the main camp. Werner found that genuinely admirable. Whatever else could be said, the prince was not the kind of commander who abandoned his men. Then someone called out to Werner. He looked toward the messenger. Reports came in one after another. Lord Reinish's unit had been reorganized and was ready. Lady Kolb confirmed that Gok's unit had finished deploying and the chain of command had been established. Werner acknowledged the good work. But then he turned and came face to face with three people he had not expected to be standing in front of him, and the reality of it hit him like a wall. It was Kolb, Reinish, and Oliver Gok. Werner's mind struggled with the sight of them. These were experienced and capable soldiers, and here they were waiting to take orders from student. He genuinely could not understand what the crown prince had been thinking. Max stepped in and introduced Werner to the three of them, making it clear that Werner had been appointed their commander by the crown prince himself. Werner introduced himself and tried to take stock of the situation. He thought through the backgrounds of those in front of him. Both Reinish and Kolb came from noble families, though neither of them personally held titles. Werner's own father and siblings were titled nobles, which meant his standing was not really any different from theirs. In terms of family rank, the Zerfield family as a count's household sat higher, so there was no particular issue with them addressing him as lord. But that was all on paper. The reality of how they actually felt about taking orders from him was another matter entirely. Reinish spoke first, commenting with a smile that he had heard this was Werner's first military campaign, and yet Werner had managed to read the enemy's movements with a clear head. He called it impressive. Werner looked at him. Reinish clearly had far more experience in the field than Werner could ever claim. Werner responded modestly, saying only that being cautious had served him well precisely because it was his first time. Reinish laughed and called him humble. Werner thought to himself that he could not blame them if they were less than thrilled about this arrangement. These were orders from the crown prince, and they had no real choice but to follow them. The kind words were nice, but Werner had no way of knowing what was really going on underneath them. He genuinely hoped he was wrong to feel any doubt, because the last thing he needed was trouble from within his own ranks on a battlefield. Kolb spoke next. On the way over, she said she had spoken with people who had received Werner's advice during the earlier fighting, and they all held him in high regard. Because of that, she said, they were genuinely glad to be fighting under his command. She turned to Gok and asked for his thoughts. Gok said plainly that Werner had shown solid judgment on the front line, and that as a mercenary, when he was given an order he followed it and gave it everything he had. Kolb seemed pleased by that, and noted that they were all in agreement, turning to Reinish for confirmation. Reinish agreed without hesitation. Werner stood quietly with his thoughts for a moment. Gok was a mercenary and the temporary commander of the adventurer and mercenary units, and Werner appreciated that Gok had not made any kind of scene about the situation. The other two, with their overly generous praise, were harder to read. He decided to take their words at face value and move forward. He thanked them and said that he too would do his best not to fall short of what the prince was expecting from him. He then moved straight into going over the state of the battle and laying out the strategy with all of them. Later, over at the left flank where the first family unit was positioned, the order was given to bring the shields forward and get into formation. The smaller shields were directed to one area, and the round shields were positioned where they were needed. Count first then addressed his assembled forces and laid out the plan. According to the message received from the crown prince, the enemy's numbers had grown and pulled together into a more consolidated force. When the enemy realized the army was not going to be lured into the woods, they had turned around and were now advancing directly. It appeared that the more intelligent forest goblins had folded into their ranks and were now moving with them. The enemy had a meaningful advantage in raw numbers, roughly double their own strength, but first made it clear that this was not an impossible gap to overcome. Importantly, the enemy had already shown signs of being shaken by attacks from the magic unit, which meant there was a real opportunity to push on that weakness and chip away at their morale. First told his men that their goal was to fight in a way that rattled the enemy as much as possible and kept them off balance. As for the specific movements of the unit, the plan was this. The 1st and 2nd Night Brigades, which were currently fighting while falling back, would split off to the left and right, opening up the front face of the enemy. Once that gap was created, the main units on the left and right flanks would move in with a counterattack. The overall aim was not to charge headlong, but to agitate the enemy, disrupt their movements, and draw back steadily but deliberately the whole time. That was the shape of the plan. Tyrone pointed out that the capital was less than an hour away on horseback from where the main unit was positioned. With so many things still uncertain, allowing the demons to get that close to the capital would be a catastrophe. Count first agreed with that concern, but laid out the reasoning behind the current approach. If this turned into a drawn-out war of attrition, their lack of preparation would put them at a serious disadvantage. The priority had to be buying time to get ready, while also wearing down the enemies will to keep fighting, all without burning through their own strength in the process. Tyrone said he had no argument with the prince's overall tactics, but that he could not bring himself to accept a strategy put together by someone as young and inexperienced as Werner. He took particular issue with a strategy that placed any kind of restrictions on chivalry. Hermine reminded him that they had already been through this discussion. Marquis Norpoth, who commanded the left flank, had already looked at the strategy and given his approval. Tyrone was not satisfied and continued to push back. Count first stepped in and added that Hermine had described Werner's approach as something genuinely new and different in its thinking. He wanted Hermine to be sent out to reinforce Marquis Norpoth's strength. Hermine agreed without hesitation. Tyrone muttered that if it had been put to him directly, the Marquis would have approved almost anything. First said he understood how his son felt about it, but he made his position clear. Given the situation they were actually in, Werner's strategy was the most logical available to them. A knight earned his place through real acts of valor, yes, but as nobles they also had a responsibility to consider the cost in lives, including those of their slave soldiers. Tyrone started to respond, but First kept going. First pointed out that while they were only dealing with the weaker enemies at the moment, there was no way of knowing when something far more dangerous would show itself. A demon that had been believed to be the enemy's ringleader had apparently been defeated, but there was still something or someone behind all of this pulling the strings from further back. The search for that presence was still ongoing, and there was no guarantee that an ill-equipped search party was going to be able to handle what they found. If it came down to a worst case, what they would be facing would be far beyond the small fry they had been dealing with so far. The others in the meeting caught on to what First was suggesting and voiced their understanding, realizing that was where they would come in if things went that far. First acknowledged it, but said it would be best if it never reached that point. Back with Werner's troops, the army was on the move. Werner watched the knights finally advancing and felt a measure of relief. Then a shout rang out, the signal he had been waiting for, and Werner gave the order to charge. They were off, and the opening was solid. The basic fighting approach was the same as before, but Werner had taken the precaution of reorganizing the knights from the Count's family units under a new leader. He looked around at the sheer number of people now moving under his command. There were so many more of them than before. In his previous life, he had never once been responsible for 200 people, let alone in a situation like this. Everything had been put together at the last minute, but he had built a system of messengers to carry his instructions quickly to each of the captains. If they could keep it up, it might actually hold together. He signaled them to pull back, then gave the signal for the others to fire. The enemy was hit with a wave of flames. Werner watched and could see it was working. No matter how many times he witnessed magic being used in this world, it continued to be something he could not quite wrap his mind around. It took effect immediately and then simply vanished, leaving no trace behind. He could not make sense of the logic behind it. One of the soldiers behind him called out with excitement that the enemy was panicking and that it was all down to Werner's orders. Werner said calmly that the credit belonged to the crown prince. In his mind, it was not false modesty that made him say it. He genuinely could not take much personal credit when he already knew how the story was supposed to go. He had to give the crown prince real recognition, though. Everything had been pulled together in an incredibly short amount of time, and the prince had handled it remarkably well. Then a knight approached from the direction of the battle. Werner watched him come. The knight introduced himself as Watchdell from the 2nd Night Brigade. Werner gave his own name in return. Watchdell looked at him steadily for a moment. Werner asked what was on his mind. Watchdell said he wanted to talk through the right flank's next moves. Werner asked what the orders coming from the main unit were. Watchdell explained that after landing a solid blow on the enemy, the intention was for the right flank to work together and push the enemy back. Werner understood that Watchdell was proposing coordinated action between them. Werner paused and asked about the state of the 2nd Night Brigade. Watchdell said casualties had been mounting, but they could hold on for the time being. Werner recognized the steadiness in the way Watchdell said it. That was the voice of someone with genuine experience. Werner thought through the situation. What he actually wanted was for the knights of the main force to pull back to the main camp, where they were currently outnumbered, so they could be closer to protect the crown prince. Because of the earlier maneuver, the 1st and 2nd Night Brigades had already been split apart and spread to the sides. Werner told Watchdell his decision. He asked Watchdell to move and join the right flank, advancing toward the main unit's side to defend it. Werner himself would head toward the center to support the Crown Prince directly. Watchdell stared at Werner. A silence stretched between them. Then Watchdell spoke in a quiet and measured way, asking whether someone from a Count's family like Werner ever felt the weight of what he was taking on. Werner felt a knot of nerves tighten inside him. The look Watchdell was giving him was hard to read, and Werner scrambled to figure out what was behind it. Was Watchdell angry? Was he offended that Werner was sending his own knights into danger for the sake of the prince? Werner could imagine a knight thinking something like that, feeling that protecting the prince was a knight's duty and that Werner had no right to put others at risk in his place. Werner could also imagine Watchdell offering to trade positions, to take the harder job himself since his own men were already exhausted. But Werner thought it through clearly. He did not know the full picture of what was happening on the left flank. If things were rough there, moving units around freely would be extremely difficult. Right now, they were the unit positioned immediately to the right of the main force. That made them the ones best placed to move there smoothly. Werner said quietly that he could only imagine how hard things had been. In his own mind, the last thing he personally wanted was to put himself somewhere that dangerous. But if the Crown Prince died in this battle, the entire army would fall apart, and they would be swallowed by the demon forces. So he told Watchdell plainly that at this moment, there was no other unit in a position to do it. They each had to do what they were able to do. Watchdell said nothing. Werner added that in the worst case, if the enemy broke through, it would fall on them to hold it. Watchdell's composure shifted slightly. He said, with what sounded like real feeling, that he was grateful for Werner's resolve. Werner was caught off guard by that. Watchdell lowered his head in a deep bow. Werner had not expected that at all. The other soldiers nearby looked just as surprised. Watchdell said with open admiration that despite Werner's age, there was something genuinely upright about him. As a knight, standing in his presence was sobering. Werner had become an inspiration to him. Watchdell turned and marched back toward the battle. Werner stood there for a moment, still processing what had just happened. Then Max came running back toward him in a hurry, wanting to know what had gone on. The adjutant general was making his way over to Werner as well. Werner noticed the state of Max's face, covered in blood splatter, and asked about it. Max wiped at his face and brushed it off. Werner told him he had come back at exactly the right moment. He gave Max the order. The Zerfield unit was going to move out and support the center of the main camp. Max understood immediately, framing it as them becoming a shield for the Crown Prince. Werner was a little caught off guard by how quickly Max had read the situation. Max then mentioned that he had been surprised to see a knight from the brigade get so openly emotional and express his gratitude to Werner the way Watchdell had. He started to say something about Werner's loyalty on top of his ability at such a young age, and then the words trailed off into an awkward silence. Werner stood with that for a moment and understood what it all actually meant from the outside. In reality, everything he had been doing was just a matter of stalling for time until Mazel could finish things on his end. If the situation ever turned truly hopeless, Werner's honest instinct would be to get out and survive. It had never once occurred to him that the people around him might be reading his actions as the willingness of someone prepared to sacrifice himself. That was why something had felt slightly off in the way things had been landing with everyone. He had not been able to put his finger on it until now. Max's eyes filled up and he asked Werner, with real emotion in his voice, when Werner had grown into the person standing in front of him. The question hit Werner somewhere unexpected and brought back memories of the two of them training together in the courtyard back home, pushing through drill side by side. Max pulled himself together and told Werner firmly that he would give everything he had in his service. Werner responded with what he hoped was enough conviction to match the moment, telling Max that they would all do their best together. Inside, Werner desperately wanted to clear the whole misunderstanding up, but there was no time for that now. He pushed it aside, called Max to attention, and gave the order to push forward again, break through the enemy's front line, and then use that momentum to provide cover for the Crown Prince. Meanwhile, on the other side of the battle, Mazel's search party had found what they were looking for. The enemy commander had appeared before them, and they were engaged in the fight, but the creature kept regenerating no matter what they did to it. Nobody in the group could figure out how to get past it. There had been no warning that this kind of demon was going to be involved. Someone checked in on Mazel, asking how he was holding up. Mazel said he was fine. Lugin said that striking at the main body should have been making some kind of progress, but it did not seem to be working. The girl in the group pointed out that even when they hit it cleanly, it came back immediately. Lugin glanced over at her and told her not to worry about it, that he had things under control, and suggested in a dismissive way that she could just head home if she wanted. She took immediate offense, firing back that this was no trouble at all and that they were more than managing, pointing out that thanks to a certain someone's friend, they had more than enough recovery potions to keep going. An attack came from behind her without warning, but Mazel caught it before it reached her, cutting the demon down. He looked at his group. Everyone was worn out. The potions were keeping them on their feet, but the fight could not go on like this indefinitely. They needed to find a way to end it. But Mazel was the first to admit to himself that this kind of thinking was not his strong point. Werner was the one with the sharp mind for working things out. That was not Mazel. He thought about Werner as he drove his blade into the enemy again. Werner's voice came back to him clearly. Werner had told him not to rush, to just be himself. Werner had also said that Mazel had an extraordinary memory and that he was better at certain things than Werner gave himself credit for. Werner had told him to look closely and think carefully about what he was seeing. Mazel's eyes sharpened. He looked at the demon in front of him with fresh attention, watching its movements and its patterns instead of just swinging at it. Something clicked. He called out to Lugents and the rest of the group and told them he had a plan. Kolb was surprised to hear that Werner intended to go and support the Crown Prince directly. Max confirmed it, explaining that after talking through the strategy with a member of the 2nd Night Brigade, Werner had made the call himself. The order was to push forward once more, break down the enemy's entire formation, and then move to the front of the main unit. Barky caught Kolb's attention as she took it in. She apologized for the pause and said she understood. She remarked quietly to Barky that Werner might very well grow into one of the most important pillars of their country in the years to come. Barky replied that if that happened, he believed the country would be in very good hands. Nearby, Reinisch was going over the details of what had happened. He noted that Werner had already earned more than enough military merit, having seen through the enemy's trap earlier and now stepping forward to serve as a shield for the Crown Prince himself. Gok added that given the circumstances, it genuinely made the most tactical sense for the 2nd Night Brigade, positioned as far back as they were, to move up to the front of the main unit. Reinisch said with open admiration that it was remarkable for someone so young, and that thinking back on his own younger years, he felt more than a little ashamed of how he had been at that age. He laughed to himself, and then went quiet for a moment. Max pointed out that these were the most exposed lines of the entire battle, and that there was no need for Reinisch to put himself in such obvious danger. Reinisch pushed back immediately, saying that protecting the Crown Prince was not danger to be avoided, but the highest honor a soldier could be given. Gok said nothing. Max said he was glad to hear it, and that they had all been given the chance to fight with everything they had for the sake of the prince. He said he could not thank Werner enough for making it possible. A short while later, Werner was deep in the middle of the fighting. The sheer number of enemies pressing in from every direction was staggering. He thought to himself that even in the game, no matter how much grinding a player did, the demon horde could never be fully wiped out. There seemed to be no end to where they were coming from. A voice called out from behind him to let him know that word had been sent to all units. Werner acknowledged it and pushed forward, calling for 3 steps and then a drive. The soldiers behind him responded and moved with him. They drove their weapons into the goblins in front of them. More enemies filled the space immediately. Werner called back to the others to send word to the main unit that they were falling back. The orcs began hurling stones, and the soldiers raised their shields to cover themselves. Werner tried to shout another order, but his voice broke and came out as almost nothing. It was no surprise. His voice had taken a beating through the whole battle. All that was left now was to keep their defenses up while they made their way forward to the front of the main unit where the Crown Prince was. The 2nd Night Brigade would be joining them, and the right flank they had been defending earlier would have to hold itself. There was nothing more Werner could do about that. All he could do was hope the left flank did not give way, because from here on he was going to be fighting at the very front and center of the line. Over on the left flank, the 1st Family unit was pressing forward behind a wall of shields. Count First was driving his soldiers hard, pushing the enemy back and calling for them to break through the enemy's ranks entirely. A voice from a distance spoke with clear admiration, saying that it was a very sensible strategy and exactly what one would expect from a family like the Firsts. The voice belonged to Marquis Norpoth, the general commander of the left flank. He remarked that it was no surprise they were so widely respected as a military family. Hermine stepped in and corrected him. The strategy had not come from her family. It had come from Lord Werner of Count Zerfield's household. The Marquis was taken aback and asked whether she meant Count Zerfield's son, the boy. Hermine confirmed it without any hesitation. She then laid out what Werner had actually given them. Before he had been moved to the right flank of the main unit, Werner had sat with Hermine and talked her through it. The plan was to build a wall of shields to slow the enemy down, then strike through the gaps in that wall. The key point Werner had stressed was that if a shield bearer fell, the entire line would collapse, so the bravest and most reliable soldiers had to be the ones holding the shields. The bodies of fallen enemies were then to be used to help cover their retreat. The Marquis was quiet for a moment as he absorbed it. Then he said he understood, and that Werner was proving to be even more than he had initially given him credit for. Tyrone muttered something under his breath as the Marquis gave his assessment. The Marquis said he would be making a report of this to the Crown Prince. Back at the center of the main unit, the Imperial Guard under the Crown Prince's direct command was fighting hard to hold the line and force a path through the demon horde. It was a punishing battle. The soldiers held their formation, and their commander scanned the field around him. Then something caught his eye. The Zerfield family unit had arrived. The commander felt the tension in his chest ease a little. The Imperial Guards pulled back, and Werner's unit marched through to take their place at the front. Werner called out to push forward, and his soldiers moved with clear determination. Things were going the way they were supposed to. The commander of the Imperial Guard told his troops that they could take a breath now and use the time to strengthen the defensive ring around the Crown Prince. The troops agreed, and the Imperial Guards looked back at the Zerfield unit pressing forward into the enemy. They tried to figure out which one was Werner. The commander pointed to the thin one with the spear. The guards watched him. They remarked that he looked like he had just walked out of school, and that he came from civil servant family of all things. Someone noted that it made sense now why the Crown Prince could not seem to leave him alone. Another agreed, and added that Lord Werner was going to have a very demanding future ahead of him. There were a few knowing sounds of agreement before the next clash pulled their attention back. Werner drove his spear into another monster and pulled a small tube from his side. He drank down a recovery potion and kept moving. One of his men reported that all units had finished repositioning and were now engaged. Werner acknowledged it and told Max to hold the front line while he stepped back slightly to focus on directing the battle from behind. Max said to leave it to him and marched off into the thick of it. Werner watched him go and thought that the man had an almost alarming amount of energy. He turned his attention back to the bigger picture. There were a lot of casualties mounting across the field. Without the potions, Werner was certain a large number of his men would already be down, including himself. His focus now was on holding a defensive position rather than pushing further. Beyond that, there was still the recovery of the wounded to manage, the constant need to account for shifting troop numbers, and the reorganization of the chain of command as things changed. Just swinging a weapon at the enemy was hard enough on its own. Managing all of this on top of it was something else entirely. Werner knew deep down that becoming a truly capable commander was something that took a long time to build. He was still very much in the early stages of that, and the weight of it was real. Behind them, the Imperial Guard were stationed at the rear. Having allies at your back was good for morale, but it also meant there was nowhere to fall back to if things went badly. Werner thought privately that if the Imperial Guards had not been there, he might have already broken and run. But with things the way they were, everyone around him was fighting with everything they had, and that energy carried through the line. Because of it, the front line had held. Werner turned to his messenger and gave the order to send a signal to the hunter unit. He thought to himself that it was about time to bring out what he had been holding in reserve. In line with the plan they had worked out with the 2nd Night Brigade, they had moved to take up position at the front, directly ahead of the Crown Prince. After everything it had taken to get there, the front lines had finally been stabilized. That meant it was time to use what Werner had been holding back. Werner gave the order. He commanded the knight beside him to signal the hunter unit to ready the slingshots, while everyone else prepared to fall back and set up for a counterattack. The knight moved immediately, waving the flag in the agreed signal. The hunters responded without hesitation, grabbing the jars they had been keeping ready. The order to fire went out, and the jars were hurled up into the air. When they came down and hit the ground, fire burst out across the area where the monsters were clustered. The demons were swallowed in flames. Werner watched and felt the relief of seeing it work. What they had used were improvised weapons, crude bottles filled with perfumed oil sealed inside flame pots. Something very close to a Molotov cocktail, put together from whatever was available. Unlike the magic used on the battlefield, which vanished the moment it finished dealing its damage, this fire kept burning. The demons caught in it panicked and thrashed wildly, rolling around in desperation as the flames clung to them. And when the rest of the demon horde surged forward from behind, those burning, flailing creatures got in the way and broke up the advance. Werner seized the moment and called for the push. The knights responded and drove forward into the gap that had opened up. Werner saw exactly what had happened. The demons on fire had broken out of formation in their panic, and that had split the enemy's 1st and 2nd units apart, opening a space between them. If they punched through that gap right now, it would count for something. Werner immediately called for the retreat, pulling them back before the next wave could close in. The move bought them time and gave the unit room to breathe before the next assault came at them. One of the knights remarked as they gathered that the strategy had worked well. Werner kept the momentum going and told them to press on. Inside his head, he was already thinking about the limits of what they could do. Repeating the same tactic over and over would have been ideal, but the supply of pots was not unlimited. The perfumed oil alone had cost an enormous amount of money. Werner had been genuinely surprised to find that essential oils existed in this world, but they were treated as a rare and precious commodity with very little available at any given time. The only reason they had been able to get this much so quickly was because of their closeness to the capital, and more specifically because of Werner's father, who used perfumed oils regularly in his role as minister of ceremonies for diplomatic events. Werner knew his father was going to be furious when he found out. He sent a quiet, private word of thanks in the old man's direction. He had used his father's name to purchase it all, but that was a problem for later. It was better than dying. Werner gave the command for the 2nd volley, and everyone moved to carry it out. He could only wonder how much longer they could keep this going. On the other side of the battle, things were moving fast in Mazel's group. Mazel had been working through what he had observed and laid out his thinking to the others while continuing to cut down the enemies around him. He had noticed something about the way the demon was regenerating. When they landed damage on the one to the left, that part of the body recovered first, while the rest of it came back more slowly than the other parts. The difference was small, but it was there. Someone in the group pointed out that the monsters had seemed to be acting as protection for the demon in the center, which was why they had been focusing their attacks on that one. Mazel pushed back on that. He did not know for certain which of the creatures was the actual main body, but even if the one on the left was not, there was a good chance it was functioning as some kind of recovery source for the others. The woman in the group understood immediately and said they should pour everything they had into that one first regardless. Mazel laid out the rest of the plan. He would keep up the appearance of attacking the center one the way they had been doing, drawing attacks from both directions and keeping the demon's attention on him. While he was doing that, Lugents and Anna would get into position and hit the leftmost one with absolutely everything they had. Lugents raised a concern about what would happen to Mazel if he was drawing attacks for both sides at once. Mazel told him it would be fine, that at the speed they could move, they could pull it off. And if he was reading things correctly, once the left one was hit hard enough, the middle demon should falter, and that would be his window to finish it. He added that if things got out of hand, Rick could throw him a potion. Rick gave a firm nod and confirmed he understood, then said it was time to move. Before Mazel could say another word, a monster came at him from behind. Lugents caught it and cut it down before it reached him. He grinned at Mazel and told him that if he found himself in serious trouble, his first priority should be protecting himself. The rest of the group silently agreed with that. Mazel gave his confirmation with a wide smile. Lugents called out to Anna to check she was ready. Anna called back with full confidence, promising to burn them to nothing. Lugents gave Mazel the signal. Mazel called back that he was on it and sprinted forward toward the enemy. The demon watched him come with something close to contempt, muttering that it was the same tired move again and that it was getting dull. In that same moment, Mazel drove his sword forward and blood sprayed across the air. The demon was caught completely off guard, shock flashing across her face as she clicked her tongue in frustration. Mazel closed his eyes and launched straight into another attack. The demon's body locked up, frozen by the sheer speed of his movements, her eyes wide and unable to track him properly. His shape cut through the thick smoke around them, and she spun toward it with fury burning in her expression. Before she could do anything with that rage, Mazel was already moving again, lunging forward and slashing clean through her body. Lugents let out a shout of triumph as the jewel on the demon's forehead cracked apart and her body crumbled to the ground. He immediately spotted something nearby and called out excitedly that there was a treasure chest, wondering aloud whether there was something valuable inside. Then the demon let out a low, quiet laugh. Mazel turned toward her. Lugents was still caught up in the excitement of the discovery, his voice carrying happily in the background. The demon lay there with a smirk still on her face. Mazel wanted to know what was amusing her. The demon told him. She said she was picturing the face of someone crushed in despair, explaining that her children would have already finished wiping out the knights by now. When the hero returned, all he would find would be a field of corpses. Mazel was over her in an instant, his voice sharp and demanding. The demon laughed again. She said she liked that expression on his face. She called it a fitting opening note for the awakening of something far greater, and then laughed again with a dark and satisfied pleasure. Mazel spun around immediately and called out to Lugents. But Lugents had not heard any of it. He was still caught up in the thrill of their victory, carrying on with the others about the size of the treasure chest they had found. Rick added his own excitement to it. Mazel called Lugents again, louder this time. When he finally had their attention, he told them plainly what the demon had said. The demons had destroyed the knights. The three of them turned to him in an instant, the celebration gone from their faces. Mazel did not wait another second. He told them they had to get back immediately. At the same moment on the other part of the battlefield, the fighting was still grinding on. One of Werner's knights came to him with urgent news. The hunters were reporting that they were nearly out of flame pots. Werner gave the order right away. The baggage handlers and the hunters were cleared to pull back. He told them to get the horses to the Zerfield estate and nothing else. The knight confirmed the order and moved off to carry it out. Werner stood with his thoughts for a moment after the knight left. Even after everything they had pushed through, the enemy was not easing up at all. And since there was still no way of knowing where the demons were coming from, trying to withdraw was more trouble than it was worth. If the Imperial Guard had not been stationed at his rear, he thought he might have been tempted to just hurl the remaining flame pots at the enemy all at once and make a run for it. The exhaustion was settling into his bones now in a way that was hard to push past. The enemy was still pressing in thick and relentless. Werner straightened himself, stood still for just a moment, and then gave the order for everyone to push back hard. The response from his soldiers was confused and uncertain at first, some of them trying to question it. But Max cut through the hesitation immediately and told the others that Werner had a plan, pointing out that the enemy was already beginning to waver. He called for the push, and the soldiers answered with a shout and drove forward together. Over on the left flank, Hermine noticed a shift in the battle and asked what had happened. Marquis Norpoth explained that through the efforts of the royal grandson, who had been sent to the capital ahead of the main fighting, reinforcements had arrived. Hermine said that was a relief to hear. Norpoth agreed and noted that the enemy had begun to settle as a result, which meant they should be able to clean things up carefully from this point. He gave a brief instruction to a nearby knight to alert him if anything changed, and then began to move. Hermine asked where he was going. Norpoth said with a grin that he thought he might join in on the remaining fight himself. He asked if she wanted to come along. Hermine smiled and accepted without a word. Not long after, the battlefield was filled with fighters from every side throwing themselves into the final push. Count Bastian, Dejin Kolb, Rheinisch Tyrone, and Hermine were all in the thick of it. The king, Commander Norpoth, Oliver, and the knights around them clashed hard against the remaining monsters. Everywhere across the field, the various groups were pushing forward without letting up, armor covered in blood, soldiers gritting their teeth and driving ahead on pure determination. Werner and Max were among them, refusing to stop. And slowly, steadily, the monsters began to give ground and fall back. Then a knight's voice rang out above the noise, declaring that they had won. The shouts spread instantly across the field, and cheers broke out everywhere. Relief and joy filled the faces of the soldiers around Werner. Werner himself stood in the middle of it all and could barely take it in. His eyes went wide. The word barely formed in his mind. They had actually won. The knights gathered around him, calling out his name and pouring their congratulations over him, saying they owed everything to his efforts. Werner stood there and thought to himself about everything that had happened, realizing slowly that he had gotten so swept up in it all that he had well and truly overcommit. He thought about his father and what was coming when the old man found out everything Werner had done and spent and decided in his name. Then he let it go. Whatever came next could wait. The thought drifted away as the last of his strength left him and his awareness faded. The knights around him reacted in alarm, calling his name in panic. Max gave the order immediately to bring a potion and get it to Werner fast. Someone rushed to carry it out. Werner, somewhere at the edge of his fading consciousness, told himself quietly that he was still alive. People were saying he had been a good man, but when it came down to it, he had been a civil servant, though it seemed he had shown real courage in the end. Word had spread that he had died protecting his younger brother. Someone wondered aloud whether it had simply been a matter of lacking proper training. A woman in the group noted that at least if the younger brother had survived, the line of succession was intact. Someone else murmured in response. Werner stood quietly in a corner, listening to the guests talk among themselves as if the death of a child were nothing more than an interesting piece of news to pick apart. Someone brought up that the eldest son had not yet been married. Another voice recalled that he had apparently been engaged to the eldest daughter of the first family, and pointed out that she had just walked past. Werner thought to himself that a child had died, and this was what people chose to talk about. Norbert guided him gently toward the exit. As they moved through the crowd, a woman's voice remarked on Werner, wondering what his skills were. Someone else answered that when you got right down to it, he was only from a civil servant family. Werner's expression darkened. He thought the word in his head. Disgusting. Then a loud laugh cut through everything else. Werner turned sharply. He recognized the woman immediately. She was his late brother's fiancée, and without any trace of sadness on her face, she was saying openly that she was relieved she would no longer have to end up married into a civil servant family. Werner's body went completely still. He stood there and thought about what this world truly was. Even allowing for the differences in culture and time, this was too cruel. These people were not human to him in that moment. They were something else entirely. Something worse. Werner was jolted awake. He was covered in sweat, gasping slightly as he came back to himself. It had been a dream. The funeral dream. He had not had that one in a while. He lay there for a moment, piecing things together. He had just spent time around the first family. Yet the woman who had been his brother's fiancée had not been among them. The thought of her made him feel sick. Then something clicked. He remembered. The demon stampede had started. He had been in the middle of it. A voice erupted somewhere nearby, announcing loudly that Lord Werner was awake. Someone burst through the door into the room. Pain hit Werner immediately. Everything in his body ached. His mother was at his side almost instantly, telling him sharply that of course he was in pain after pushing himself the way he had. She told him he had been treated, but had been unconscious for an entire day, and that they had all been beside themselves with worry. Werner apologized, his voice coming out rough and barely there. His mother said they would start by treating his throat, since he clearly needed it to give orders. She called for Norbert to bring a potion. Norbert appeared and handed it over. Werner drank it down in one go and looked at the two of them. He could see how genuinely worried they had been. It reminded him of when he had first woken up in this world after his reincarnation, that same disorientation and relief at being alive. He made sure he had not somehow jumped worlds again. He asked about the demon stampede. His mother told him with a slight smirk that they had won, and he was not to worry. Werner said he was glad to hear it. He thought quietly to himself that what he had heard during the battle had not been a dream then. He had really heard those cries of victory. His mother then told him that once he could speak properly again, he was to go and report to his father. Later, in his father's office, his father told him there was a great deal he had to say to him. But given that Werner had received commendations directly from the royal family, he could not bring himself to be too hard on him. Werner was not sure what to make of that. His father explained that an envoy sent personally from the royal family had come to check on Werner shortly after the battle. Werner was genuinely surprised. His father added that representatives from the first and Rhinish families had followed not long after. He handed Werner a scroll and told him to look it over carefully. Werner unrolled it and let out a quiet breath when he saw what was on it. His father continued, saying that in 5 days Werner would have the opportunity to receive a medal of honor before the crown prince himself, and that he should keep himself ready for that. Werner rolled the scroll closed and told his father he was sorry for all the trouble he had caused. His father's expression tightened slightly, and he let out a short sigh. Then he acknowledged that Werner's quick thinking had saved a great many lives, and that Max and the others had not stopped talking about him since. He told Werner he had done well. He then asked whether Werner was feeling better. Werner said he was much better. His father gave a small nod and said he would want Werner's account of the perfumed oil at some point, though it was not urgent. He also told Werner that until the ceremony he did not need to go back to school, that this time was for rest. That was all. As they stepped outside, Norbert said cheerfully that it was good to see the master looking so pleased. Werner said he supposed so, and hoped it would stay that way. Then something came back to him, and he asked Norbert to bring him some documents he needed to look over. Later, reading through them, Werner quietly noted the names. Viscounts Crank and Mittig had died. The militant Baron Donenal had been gravely wounded. Werner sat with that for a moment. The deaths had reached into the nobility as well. Many of the students had been among the casualties. For nobles, there were structures in place to manage what came after. But for those of common birth, the cost of treatment and funerals fell heavily on families that had very little to spare. Werner did not know most of them personally, but still, he told Norbert to find out which of his school friends were among the dead. He would write letters of condolence under his own name, and he wanted a personal representative sent to attend the funerals on his behalf. He also wanted to know if any of the deceased had younger siblings. If those siblings wished to attend the academy in the coming years, he wanted to support their enrollment under the name of the Count's family. He would put the proposal to his father. Norbert nodded, said he would send someone suitable, and left. Werner sat alone with his thoughts. People had died, not just people, his classmates. And here he was, sitting calmly and going through documents. He found that deeply unsettling about himself. He was almost certain that if Max or any of his own men had died or been seriously hurt, he would not be calm at all. So was this detachment coming from somewhere deeper, from the part of him that still thought of this world as a game rather than a real place with real people in it? He turned the question over and let it sit. Whatever the answer was, the more immediate thing to think about now was what this victory actually meant for the story going forward. They had deviated from the game's script in significant ways. He hoped that would not end up working against Mazel somewhere down the line. Looking back on how the battle had unfolded, Werner felt a genuine sense of reassurance about the Crown Prince. The man's judgment under pressure had been sharp and decisive. For someone who was going to need to prepare for an eventual attack on the capital, knowing that such a ruler and those knights were on their side was more comforting than Werner had expected it to be. He thought ahead to what he remembered of the game's story. The next major conflict involving Mazel was supposed to take place at Werisa Fortress. The question was whether things would still follow the original script now that so much had already shifted. He had no way of controlling that. But in the meantime, he wanted to do what he could to strengthen the capital's defenses. Upgrading equipment, improving strategy, something along those lines. The demons had come at them in a straight line during the stampede, which had made it possible to manage with borrowed tactics and book knowledge. And the bulk of what they had been fighting had still been on the weaker end of what the demon forces could produce. If they ever faced an enemy with real intelligence and real power, group combat training was going to become absolutely essential. The problem was that Werner, even as the son of a count, did not personally hold title. And on top of that, his family were civil servants in a world that placed its highest value on individual military strength. A world built around warriors and personal glory. He was going to have to work through Max and the men closest to him, using them to quietly spread better fighting methods to others. The harder problem was that news of the Demon Lord's revival had not yet reached most people. Now that the stampede was over, convincing anyone to stay sharp and prepare for something worse was going to be an uphill struggle. This world rewarded individual valor. A speech about working together and planning ahead was not something it was built to listen to. Werner knew that what he was proposing was going to meet serious resistance from a great many people. He needed to find a way to make them truly understand the situation and grasp how important group warfare and proper strategy were going to become. The Demon Lord's revival was going to change everything about how the demons operated, their numbers, their distribution, their strength. If he could make people see that clearly, then maybe they would understand just how serious things truly were. Just then, a man came to Werner. His name was Frentzen, and he had been asked to personally represent Werner at the funerals. Werner thanked him and handed him something to give out to those who appear to be in need. He told Frentzen that if it was not enough, he should come back and ask for more. Frentzen understood and left to carry out the task. Werner sat with his thoughts afterward. He needed to figure out their next steps, while also dealing with everything that had come out of the demon stampede. There was a great deal to manage. Taking stock of the damages, handling the funerals, arranging medical treatment, sorting out the medals for those who had distinguished themselves. All of it took time. Outside, heavy rain was falling steadily. Werner looked out at it, and thought that for once he did not mind having a reason not to go to school. Several days passed. Out in the garden, the sharp ringing sound of metal striking metal filled the air. Werner was moving and dodging while Mazel pushed in with another attack. Mazel grabbed Werner's arm, lifted him clean off the ground, stepped into his footing, and threw him. Werner went airborne, hit the ground hard, and landed with a gasp of pain. Mazel pinned his arms behind his back and smirked. Werner told him to ease up, reminding him that he was still supposed to be recovering. Mazel grinned and said he would never go easy on the hero of the demon stampede. Werner told him loudly to knock it off. Afterward, a servant came out to them with snacks. Mazel was in high spirits and could not stop talking about what Werner had done. The whole school was already buzzing about it, he said. How Werner had watched the enemy's movements, spotted the trap before anyone else, and then launched the counterattack at exactly the right moment when the enemy was already falling apart. He mentioned that someone called Lord Hubertus had been speaking very highly of Werner, calling his ability to read a battle truly outstanding. Werner did not place the name immediately, and the servant stepped in to clarify, before excusing herself. Mazel scratched his head and explained that Lord Hubertus was the crown prince, adding that using the informal name was just a habit he had not managed to shake. Werner recognized it then and rubbed his forehead, telling Mazel he was making far too much of it all. Mazel added that the crown prince had also commented on the unusual fighting style Werner had used, describing it as something resembling a porcupine, something the prince had never encountered before but found remarkably effective. Werner thought about that for a moment. The crown prince was almost certainly referring to the phalanx formation. The first family had managed to execute it well on the battlefield despite the rough and rushed way Werner had explained it to them. He gave credit where it was due. That came down to them being a military family through and through. He stopped that line of thinking before it went somewhere uncharitable. Mazel then reached into his things and pulled out some letters, showing them to Werner with a different kind of energy now. Werner started to assume they were more social invitations and began to say he had already told Mazel about those. Mazel stopped him and explained what the letters actually were. One was from the younger sister of Kalvitz. Another was from the father of Balzar. Another was from William's family. Mazel had attended their funerals, and they had asked him to pass along their thanks to Werner. They had been deeply moved that someone from the nobility had thought of them and reached out the way Werner had. Werner said quietly that the students who had not been from noble families or registered as adventurers should never have been anywhere near the fighting. They should have been kept on standby from the start. Mazel agreed, but said that nobody had expected things to spiral the way they did. Werner acknowledged that. Mazel grew quieter for a moment, then said something that Werner was not quite prepared for. He said that because of Werner, what those people had been trying to protect had been protected. It was not just that peace had come back. It was that there was someone in the world who would grieve for them properly. The only sadness was that the dead could not be brought back. Mazel said simply and sincerely that he truly believed it was a good thing someone like Werner existed. Werner was caught off guard by that. He gathered himself and redirected the praise, saying that if anyone deserved to be recognized, it was the hero who had actually gone and defeated the demon boss. Mazel pushed back immediately, telling Werner not to do that too. Werner told him not to be modest about it. Without Mazel breaking the crystal that had been controlling the monsters, there was no telling how the whole thing would have ended. Werner then brought up something that had been sitting in the back of his mind and asked whether Mazel had ever found out what the black jewel was that he had found. Mazel said that apparently not even the material it was made from could be identified by anyone. Werner muttered to himself, turning that over quietly. He wondered if that had been in the game at all. He did not remember it. He pushed the thought aside, smiled, and said that regardless of everything else, it all came back to what Mazel had accomplished. Mazel said he had already heard more than enough of that at school. Then Mazel explained the real reason he had come over, beyond delivering the letters. He said that the commoners at school had gone to considerable lengths to carve out an escape route for him, so he could get away. Werner said that sounded a bit dramatic. Mazel reminded him that he was a commoner himself and had absolutely no idea how to handle turning down an invitation from a noble without causing offense. He also had no idea what to wear or how to behave at the medal ceremony the following day. Werner thought to himself that he wanted to place the blame on the teachers for not preparing Mazel better, but as a friend, he simply could not leave Mazel without help when Mazel came to him. He told Mazel that this happened to be exactly the kind of thing he knew well. Mazel lit up with relief. Werner thought that he was going to need to step in more regularly once they were back at school. He told Mazel that when it came to turning down invitations, he could simply use the excuse that he was only a student and that it was a perfectly acceptable one. For the ceremony, he should just wear his school uniform. Mazel was surprised and asked if that was really appropriate. Werner told him it was considered formal attire in this context. Inside his own head, Werner was already thinking beyond the ceremony. He wanted the victory celebration to go smoothly and without any complications first. Whatever conversations needed to happen could come after that. The day of the medal ceremony arrived. The king stood before the gathered assembly and made his announcements. And then, among those announcements, came something Werner had not seen coming at all. The king declared that upon Werner von Zerfield, the legitimate son of Lord Zerfield, the title of Viscount was hereby bestowed. Werner stood there and could not for the life of him understand how this had happened. Several days after the demon stampede, the victory celebration was being held at the palace, and everything was running smoothly. Werner had just started to let himself think about what lay ahead when the medal ceremony began and pulled his attention back to the present. The king opened with the first name in order of merit, calling forward the crown prince. The crown prince responded with the appropriate words of humility and gratitude. The king then called the second name, Werner's father, acknowledging that his unit had played a crucial role in the battle and that his achievements were highly deserving of recognition. Werner's father bowed and offered his thanks. Then the king continued and called Werner's name as well, and announced that the title of Viscount was being bestowed upon him. Werner stood there in complete disbelief, his thoughts erupting silently while his face and body performed the correct movements. He bowed and offered his thanks to the king with all the proper words while his mind was screaming the opposite. The two of them rose. Werner could feel eyes pressing into his back from behind. He thought to himself that if looks could actually kill, he would already be on the floor. The men around him stood silently. Werner let out a quiet breath and let his gaze drift upward for a moment. He noticed, not for the first time, how strangely modern the architecture and uniforms of the capital and palace looked compared to the rural villages elsewhere in this world, which were entirely medieval in feel. He wondered if that kind of inconsistency existed because this world had originally been a video game, where different locations could simply look however the designers wanted them to. It was one of those moments where the gap between what felt real and what he knew to be true hit him unexpectedly hard. He pushed it aside. None of it mattered right now. The king moved on and called the third name in order of merit. It was Mazel Harding. Mazel stepped forward and knelt before the king. Werner watched him and thought privately that if merit had been ranked honestly, Mazel should have been first. He kept that thought entirely to himself. He looked at Mazel kneeling there and thought that Mazel presented himself exactly as a main character should, naturally and without any apparent effort. It suited him, but Werner felt a small pang about something. He wished Mazel's family could have been here to see this. Mazel had not even told them it was happening, let alone invited them. His reasoning had been that they lived so far away in Arlia that they would have had to stay at an inn, and getting there would have been difficult. Werner could not argue with the logic. Arlia was genuinely far from the capital. Even with an invitation sent in time, there was the journey itself and the family business to consider. Still, Mazel clearly had a good relationship with his family, and Werner suspected he would have been quietly happy if they had somehow been able to make it. Werner's mind wandered briefly. He found himself thinking about the skywalk boot from the game, an item that could cover enormous distances in moments. He wondered why nothing like that seemed to be available anywhere near the capital, or whether such things were even known to exist here. He made a mental note to look into it at some point. He shifted his gaze and found Mazel already looking back at him. Mazel broke into a wide, bright smile. Werner smiled back and thought that he really should not have been surprised. Of course, the main character could make even a moment like this look effortless. The king continued the ceremony and called Marquis Danilo Stipe Norpoth forward as the fourth in order of merit. Werner turned his attention back to standing quietly and waiting for the standing banquet that would follow. As the ceremony wound down, Werner looked around the room and recognized faces scattered throughout the gathering. Then someone approached. It was Mazel, appearing beside him and offering a quiet word of acknowledgement. Werner sighed and said back to him that the real struggle was only just beginning. He could already see the ladies in the room stealing looks in their direction while the men watched with sharp, calculating eyes and edged gradually closer. Werner's own expression tightened. He thought that he and Mazel were going to have to look out for each other through the evening ahead, and then admitted to Mazel that his stomach was already hurting just thinking about it. Mazel asked what was wrong with him. He pointed out that being made a viscount essentially meant the king was telling Werner to step up and assist his father the count, that he had been recognized as his father's successor. Mazel thought that sounded like a reason to feel good about things. Werner said that was not quite why the king had done it. He explained what it actually meant in practical terms. The title came with obligations. The king was effectively saying that Werner was still a student, but that he was being recognized as someone ready to take on the responsibilities of the count household, and that as a member of the aristocracy, he was expected to fulfill military and other duties accordingly. Mazel acknowledged it sounded demanding, but said Werner had already proven he could get things done, so it made sense that people would want to put him to work. Werner told him that was absolutely not helping. Inside his thoughts, the weight of it settled heavily. The capital was almost certainly going to come under attack at some point in the story ahead. That meant he was going to be spending a great deal of time inside the royal castle, carrying out his duties. And the more he was on the battlefield, the higher his chances of getting himself killed. His expression darkened without him meaning it to. Mazel noticed and remarked that Werner seemed to be the only person in the room taking the new title as a bad thing. Werner said that was because Mazel was not thinking about it carefully enough. Then someone stepped up to them. Both Werner and Mazel turned quickly. It was Marquis Norpoth, who offered his congratulations to Werner. They both bowed. Werner thanked him and then, in the same breath, apologized sincerely for the breach of protocol during the battle. Marquis Norpoth's expression shifted into something between amusement and approval. He said that as long as Werner understood what he had done, that was enough. He added that he had spoken with the crown prince, who had told him not to be too hard on Werner, given how young he was. Looking at Werner now, the Marquis said he could see that kind of caution was not going to be necessary. Werner thanked him with genuine respect. The Marquis muttered that the count appeared to have raised a very fine son, and said he would be watching Werner's path forward with real interest before excusing himself and walking away. Werner offered his thanks as he left. The moment the Marquis was out of earshot, Mazel wanted to know what all of that had been about. Werner explained it plainly. During the demon stampede, when he had realized the enemy's retreat was a trap, he had gone directly to the crown prince to warn him. The proper thing to do would have been to report first to his direct commanding officer, which had been Lord Norpoth. Werner had skipped that entirely and gone straight to the top, because there had been no time to do otherwise. It had been the right call in the moment, but it had also been a clear breach of the chain of command, and that was what the apology had been for. The proper chain of command would have been for Werner to report to Marquis Norpoth, who would then have passed the warning up to the crown prince. Mazel pointed out that going through all of that would have cut things dangerously close to being too late. Werner agreed. There simply had not been time to stand around convincing Marquis Norpoth. But at the same time, Werner acknowledged that an army could not function if everyone started breaking rules the moment they decided the situation called for it. That kind of thinking would destroy discipline entirely. Mazel took that in quietly. Then he looked at Werner and asked, with genuine bewilderment, whether they were really the same age, because he never would have thought through any of that on his own. Werner said simply that being raised as an aristocrat had something to do with it. Then a voice cut into their conversation, saying that being an aristocrat could not be the only explanation. Werner turned. It was Count Bastian, who said that Werner had distinguished himself genuinely well in battle. Werner deflected politely and gave the credit to the knights. The Count smiled at that, and then did something Werner had not expected. He apologized for how dismissive he had been toward Werner before the stampede began. Werner's eyes went wide, and he told the Count there was nothing to apologize for. Count Bastian brushed that aside firmly and said plainly that he had underestimated Werner's ability to command, and that was the truth of it. Werner went quiet for a moment and thought through what was actually happening. Count Bastian was choosing to apologize to Werner personally rather than going through the proper channels, which would have meant apologizing formally to Werner's father as the head of the Zerfield household. Doing it the right way would have turned into a significant event involving questions of face and standing between two noble families. This quieter, personal approach was the Count's way of handling it while keeping things simple. Werner understood that and accepted it graciously, careful not to use the word apology himself, which was his way of showing courtesy in return. But something else was sitting with Werner. Count Bastian's eldest son Tyrone had not been listed among the seriously injured. And even if he had taken some kind of wound, this world had potions and healing magic that could deal with anything minor without trouble. If Tyrone had wanted to be here tonight, there was no reason he could not have been. His absence was notable, and Werner was not going to pretend it did not register. The polite thing was to say nothing about it, and so he said nothing. Count Bastian mentioned that their territories bordered each other and expressed his hope that they could continue to maintain a good relationship going forward. Werner responded warmly, saying both he and his father looked forward to a strong and cooperative relationship and that anything that needed to be discussed should go through his father. The Count acknowledged that and excused himself. As he turned to leave, Hermine caught Werner's eye and told him she would love the chance to discuss battle strategies with him at some point, without the pressure of the battlefield around them. Werner told her any time would be fine. She smiled and left with her father. Werner watched them go and thought about the shift in how Hermine had carried herself toward him. The subtle way she used to look down on them for being a civil servant family was not there anymore. He was not asking for anything more than that. Just having their neighboring houses get along without friction was enough. Mazel, standing beside him, observed that Werner seemed to be getting pulled in every direction at once and said it looked exhausting. Werner agreed that yes, it was. Then he nodded toward the growing cluster of people gathering around Mazel and said it was nothing compared to what Mazel was dealing with. Mazel looked confused by that, but he was about to find out. Not long after, the crowd around Mazel had grown into something almost impossible to manage. A nobleman approached and began pressing Mazel about meeting his daughter. Werner stepped in immediately and pointed out that the man's daughter was 3 years old. Mazel added carefully that he was only a student, thanked the man, and said perhaps someday. Then someone else wanted a moment with him. Then another nobleman was already pushing forward to introduce his daughter. Werner watched it all from the edge of his patience and thought to himself that the ages being presented to Mazel were all over the place, and none of it was appropriate. People were practically lining up to push children and grown women at him without any real thought for whether any of it made sense. He understood what was driving it. A commoner with hero-level skills who had personally helped bring down the demon stampede was an enormously attractive prospect for any family with ambitions. This kind of scene probably would never have unfolded at all if things had gone the way the game's story originally laid out, with the royal knights wiped out and the crown prince and his son dead. Peace had its advantages, he supposed, but the hard reality was that they had already moved far away from the original script. All Werner could do now was hope that when the fall of Werisa Fortress came, it would still happen the way the game had shown it. And when it did, a number of the people standing in this very room tonight would likely die. The fact that he was quietly hoping for that particular event to stay on course was not something that sat easily with him. But it was the truth. When they finally managed to pull themselves away from the crowd, Mazel said Werner had genuinely saved him. Werner looked at his friend and thought that Mazel being tired was something new. Not that he could blame him. Werner told Mazel he would take him to lunch as a thank you sometime. Mazel said 3 lunches and they would call it even. Werner thought about what had just happened and everything it represented. If it was already like this on the palace floor, he could only imagine what it was going to be like back at school. But this was only the beginning. For things to go the way Werner needed them to go, it actually had to be this way. Mazel's growing reputation and recognition were important. The harder things got from Mazel, in terms of expectations and the weight people placed on him, the more that fit the shape of the story that needed to unfold. Werner knew that thinking that way made him selfish. He was not blind to it. Over a decade of working and planning with his own survival as the only real goal had done that to him. He sat with that uncomfortable truth for a moment. Then a woman's voice came from beside them, offering a soft apology for interrupting. Both Werner and Mazel turned toward her. The moment Werner saw her face, he bowed immediately and deeply. The woman told him that such formality was not necessary and introduced herself. She was Laura Louise Weinzierl. Werner's thoughts scattered in every direction at once. This was not right. She was not supposed to appear until much later in the story. What was she doing here now? Standing before them was the game's heroine, Princess Laura. She asked if she might have a moment with the two of them. The princess led them toward a door. The light outside was bright and caught against Werner's face as they stepped through it. They were guided into a garden where the princess walked with her attendants ahead of them. Werner followed along quietly. Mazel murmured beside him that the princess was very beautiful. Werner replied under his breath that good looks seemed to be a requirement for royalty, at least in his experience. But even as he said it, he was paying attention to where they were being led. They were heading deep into the castle grounds. In the game, this particular section of the palace was only accessible after the capital had been partially destroyed during the Great Attack. That was what Werner remembered. He looked around and recognized the place with a growing unease. The princess stopped and told them they had arrived. Werner looked ahead and saw someone already standing and waiting for them inside a gazebo. The setting felt unmistakably like the inner sanctum of a palace, thoughtfully and deliberately designed. Even Werner, who did not consider himself someone with a refined eye for these things, could tell it had been crafted with great care. It was a far cry from what he was used to at home. The person waiting for them was the crown prince. Both Werner and Mazel went still with shock. The prince smiled and apologized for having brought them all the way out there. Werner's heart was beating hard. He looked around and took in exactly who was present. The crown prince was there. The heroine was there. The main character was there. And Werner was there, the background character, standing in the middle of all of them. In his head, he felt entirely out of his depth. Technically, as a nobleman, he belonged in this kind of company more than Mazel did. But looking at Mazel standing there completely at ease, Werner thought that was just what came with being the protagonist. Then the crown prince did something that made both of them react in shock. He bowed his head to them and expressed his genuine gratitude, saying that both of them had saved him during the stampede. Mazel brushed it off immediately, saying they had simply been in a position to help. Werner said the same, insisting that nothing had been accomplished by his efforts alone. Inside, Werner felt deeply uncomfortable watching the crown prince bow to him like that. He wanted to stop. He decided to change the subject and began to speak, but the princess cut in gently before he could get far. She told him there was no need for formal titles or stiff language among them here, and that no one would think less of Werner for speaking more naturally. Werner was about to object, but she was firm about it. He glanced at the crown prince, who gave a small nod of agreement. Werner accepted it. If the crown prince himself was permitting it, he had no real grounds to refuse. Werner then mentioned to the princess that he had not expected to find her at the palace, having assumed she was at the great temple of Finoi. The princess remarked that he was well informed. Werner said he had heard it from his father. The crown prince recognized that the minister of ceremonies would naturally be privy to such things and found nothing unusual in it. The truth was that Werner knew about it because of the game. In the game's story, the great temple of Finoi was attacked by one of the demon lord's 3 generals, and it was when Mazel heard about the attack and rushed there that he met Princess Laura for the first time. That was how their meeting was supposed to happen. Werner was not sure yet whether their meeting here instead was going to cause problems or not. The crown prince explained that Laura had received a divine message and had returned to the capital specifically to deliver it to the king in person. Werner asked what the message had said. The crown prince told him it concerned the revival of the demon lord. Mazel could barely contain his reaction, asking immediately whether it was really true. The crown prince said that they could confirm that Laura had indeed received the message. Werner absorbed that quietly. In his mind, the contents of the message were a state secret. That made it all the more striking that the prince was sharing it here. The prince added that they did not yet have enough information to verify whether the revival had actually occurred. Werner thought that made sense. There were old stories of an ancient kingdom said to have been brought down by the demon lord long ago, and the ruins of it still existed. But the demon lord itself was largely dismissed by most people as legend and nothing more. Laura added that what she had said was not common knowledge beyond a small circle. She also explained that divine messages came in different degrees of significance, something that only oracles capable of receiving such messages could truly understand. But this particular message carried a weight unlike anything ordinary. That was why she had come back to the capital directly, to speak with her father, the king herself. Werner understood. He suspected the king's reaction might have been mixed, but having just experienced such a wildly abnormal demon stampede, the crown prince had probably found the message credible enough to take seriously. What Werner could not work out was why both he and Mazel had been brought here. Laura explained that part of the divine message had suggested the hero would play an exceptionally important role in what was to come. She had wanted to meet the hero in person, and so she had invited him here. Werner turned that over in his mind. In this world, being called a hero did not automatically mean someone was destined to defeat a demon lord. It was simply understood that such a person possessed unusual and rare abilities. Even if the knights had been destroyed in the stampede, there would still have been plenty of fighters ready to step up out of a hunger for personal glory. Werner was curious how the king would have gone about it in that case, sending a first-year student to confront the greatest evil in the world. He also suspected that the king had probably been told of the divine message in some form in the original game's timeline, and that it was what had set Mazel off on his journey after the stampede. Werner spoke up and said he understood why Mazel had been summoned, but asked plainly why he had been included. The crown prince explained that he simply wanted Werner to serve as a bridge and a buffer between Mazel and the royal family. Mazel was curious what that meant. Werner put it into words himself. Since the divine message could not be made public, the royal family could not simply be seen calling a commoner like Mazel to the palace on a regular basis without raising questions. Having Werner involved made it easier to arrange and less conspicuous. The princess said that Werner's sharp grasp of things made it all more manageable. Werner thought about the fuller picture. If the crown prince had died in the battle the way the game's original story had it, the news of the demon lord's revival would have carried far more weight. No one would have questioned the king openly bringing in a commoner like Mazel to consult with him in the middle of a crisis. But now, because the crown prince had survived, partly because of what Werner himself had done, that situation was more complicated. It was partly Werner's own doing that made things harder now. The crown prince concluded by saying that while they worked to verify the truth of the revival, they wanted to keep a close and reliable connection with Mazel, and that was the thinking behind all of this. Werner felt a measure of relief settling in despite everything. Even with how far the story had already shifted from the original game, the fact that the royal family still recognized the hero as the key to defeating the demon lord was reassuring. Mazel pointed out simply that it made natural sense for a viscount like Werner to visit the castle. The prince nodded. Werner added that it equally made sense for Mazel to speak with Werner while they were on campus together, which provided a natural and unremarkable cover for their connection. Mazel then asked what the prince had meant about Werner serving as a wall. Werner explained it by pointing to what had just happened at the banquet, where he had stepped in to keep the nobility from trying to pull Mazel away in every direction. He laid out the bigger picture as well. At this point, the royal family did not have a strong enough public reason to formally take Mazel under their protection, which meant they had no real way to stop foreign powers or other noble houses from trying to recruit him. If Mazel ended up tied to some noble household before the royal family needed him most, they would have to negotiate through that household every time they wanted his involvement. And there was no guarantee that whoever took Mazel in would be cooperative or reasonable when it mattered. The prince agreed with all of it. Then the prince put forward an idea that Werner had not anticipated. He asked Werner whether he would have any objection to Mazel being made his knight. Werner's reaction was immediate. He asked the prince not to put that on him. There were several strong reasons why he needed to turn this down completely. He explained to the prince that he and Mazel were friends, not a lord and his subordinate. Werner would obey any order from the royal family without question and would do everything in his power to help Mazel. But he had no intention of becoming Mazel's lord and master. In his own mind, the reason ran even deeper than that. The hero was supposed to defeat the demon lord and build a future with the princess. If Werner became his lord, he could easily find himself dragged into political conflicts that had nothing to do with him and end up dead as a result. The prince suggested that the arrangement could simply be a formality, something that existed only in appearance without changing the real nature of their relationship. He mentioned that he had people in similar arrangements himself. Werner understood what the prince was actually doing. By framing this as a proposal rather than a direct order, the prince was testing Werner, trying to get a sense of how ambitious he was and what he was actually after. Werner held his ground politely but firmly. The prince accepted it and moved on, but said that regardless of the formal arrangement, he still hoped Werner would support Mazel's activities while in the capital. Werner accepted that without hesitation. In his mind, thinking about what Mazel was going to be doing in the not-too-distant future, he would have preferred to keep his distance from that too. But the royal family now openly acknowledged their friendship, and it was far too late to pretend otherwise. What he was being asked to do was not join an adventure. It was simply to support Mazel from his position as a noble, which was something he could manage. The princess offered Werner her gratitude and said he was too generous. Werner's mind quietly drifted to something he remembered from the game. When a player set off with a hero to defeat the demon lord, they started with barely enough money to get by and could not afford the best equipment available. This moment, right here, might actually be the perfect opportunity to do something about that. Whatever they could prepare and provide for Mazel now would only improve his chances when the real confrontation came. Werner wondered if this was a good moment to quietly ask the prince for some funding. Before he could settle on that thought, the prince said he looked forward to working with Mazel, and Mazel responded with respectful agreement. The prince then excused himself and walked away. Werner glanced at Mazel as he watched the prince leave. Mazel was the kind of person who had apparently been too busy worrying about everyone back at school to even mention his own accomplishments during the stampede to anyone. That was just who he was. And looking at the situation now, whether it was equipment, connections, or preparation, being in a position to actually do something for his friend before he set off on a journey with the fate of the entire world resting on him was far better than standing helplessly on the sidelines. Princess Laura then turned to Werner and offered a quiet word of condolence about his older brother. Werner told her not to worry about it, and that he truly did not mind. Mazel looked between them in confusion. Werner told him not to worry about it either. Mazel accepted that with some uncertainty. Werner thought about the two of them standing there, the Crown Prince and Princess Laura. If he had not known the full story, the age difference between them might have made him mistake them for father and daughter at a glance. Then something clicked in his mind as he looked at Mazel and the princess standing together. He told the two of them that he needed to slip away to use the restroom for a moment and left Mazel to manage the conversation, asking one of the attendants to show him the way. The attendant smiled and agreed. Werner thought a quiet apology in Mazel's direction as he walked away. This was a good opportunity to nudge things along between Mazel and the princess. It was a little earlier than expected in the story's timeline, but there was no harm in letting them get to know each other sooner. The princess had come across as warm and playful on first impression, so Mazel would be fine. Whether the small details of the story changed from here was one thing, but perhaps the overall shape of it would hold together regardless. Or maybe that was wishful thinking. Either way, Werner still needed the story to change in one very specific and important way when the time came. As he walked through the hallway, his mind went somewhere darker. He found himself looking at the guards stationed along the corridor and wondering which of them would be among the dead when the capital eventually came under attack. He thought about the attendant walking ahead of him and wondered the same thing about her. Then one of the attendants spoke up and turned toward him. She said, with some hesitation and a great deal of sincerity, that if Werner would forgive the forwardness of it, she and the others wanted to express their deepest gratitude to him. Werner looked at her and asked what on earth he had done to deserve that kind of thanks. He genuinely could not place it. The attendants exchanged a quiet look between themselves before one of them began to explain. The first attendant explained. Her father was a knight, and the other attendant's older brother served under Count First. They had heard how Werner had seen through the monster's trap before it could close around the army. If not for that, both of their family members might very well have died in the battle. They were deeply grateful. Werner went completely still. The attendant apologized for the forwardness of saying it, but said that they had wanted so much to thank him at least once with their own words. Werner did not know how to respond. He managed to say something quiet and simple, telling her it was nothing and that they were very welcome. Then the attendants led him the rest of the way to the restroom. Alone for a moment, Werner turned on the faucet and washed his hands, privately grateful that this world had running water. They had never shown bathrooms in the game, so finding that the basic infrastructure existed had been a relief when he first discovered it. Living through something resembling the Middle Ages would have been genuinely hard on someone raised in modern Japan. But then again, if this world had magic capable of creating things from nothing, it made sense that people would have applied that same ingenuity to the practical necessities of daily life, things like plumbing and waterworks. Magic had its limits, though. It was not all powerful. People still died. That was exactly why he had spent so many years working himself as hard as he had. From a moment he had remembered his past life as a child. He had known what the demon stampede was going to bring. He had gone into it with everything he had. He had survived it and cleared that first enormous obstacle. But standing there alone, he found himself wondering whether he could have done more. He had poured everything into making sure Mazel would be all right and had largely stopped thinking about the other students around them. Was that because somewhere underneath it all, he had still been treating this world as though it were only a game? But the guard in that hallway, those attendants and the families they had talked about, Mazel, the students who had died, all of them were real people living real lives with real connections to one another. Werner was not arrogant enough to think he could have saved everyone, and neither could Mazel. But if he could at least feel that he had genuinely given everything he had, that would help. It would sit easier with him when the nights got quiet. That was what he wanted going forward. The honest truth was that he had only ever wanted to survive. Everything that had worked out for other people had been a side effect of that. The gratitude from those attendants had stung precisely because of that. But if the consequence of acting in his own interest was that someone else got to go home alive, then maybe that was the right way to look at things going forward. He could not match Mazel in raw fighting ability, and he had no overwhelming special power of his own. But he had the knowledge of how the game played out and the influence that came with being a noble. He did not need to leave everything on Mazel's shoulders. It was all right to aim for more than just keeping himself breathing. He was still deep in that thought when, back in a room he had stepped away from, Princess Laura was asking Mazel a quiet question. She had noticed how much Werner and Mazel seemed to genuinely trust each other and asked if that was really the case. Mazel said he certainly hoped so. He apologized in advance and said he knew it might be a strange thing to ask, but told her he was curious about something. He asked if the princess could answer. She said she would answer whatever she was able to. Mazel asked why Werner had turned down the idea of making Mazel his knight. From where Mazel stood, becoming Werner's knight would have meant fewer countries and noble houses approaching him directly, which would actually have made things easier for Werner rather than harder. And when the order eventually came to defeat the demon lord, Werner could simply have sent Mazel out to do it. Mazel could not understand why Werner would refuse something that seemed to benefit everyone. The princess explained what had actually been happening. Her brother had been testing Werner's ambitions. She herself believed the demon lord's revival to be real, and that Mazel was the only real hope of stopping it. If Mazel became Werner's knight, Werner would effectively hold immeasurable power as Mazel's master. She was fairly certain that Werner was not the kind of person to put his own interests ahead of everything else, but there were many people, including her own brother, who were not so sure. A great many people would want to use Mazel for their own ends. Her brother and her father both believed, purely from the perspective of what was best for the nation, that keeping Mazel close to the royal family and having him belong to the crown was the safest arrangement. Werner had understood all of that, and this was only her own personal reading of things, she added, but she believed Werner had turned it down simply because he wanted to stay Mazel's friend. Nothing more and nothing less than that. She said quietly that she had people in her own life who were precious to her in a way that made the idea of making them her servants completely unthinkable. Mazel was surprised to hear that from her. She asked if it was really so surprising and said she felt a little hurt by his reaction. Mazel immediately tried to apologize. The princess laughed and told him she was only teasing. She had just wanted to find a way to break the ice a little. Mazel's expression went from startled to even more startled. She asked if that was annoying to him. He said not at all. She smiled. Mazel laughed. The two of them had settled into something warm and easy without quite noticing it had happened. Werner had made his way back by then and was at the door. He could hear voices and laughter from inside. He apologized for interrupting as he stepped in. Both Mazel and the princess welcomed him back. The princess told Werner that Mazel had just been telling her about a time the two of them had gotten into a scuffle with older students at the academy. Werner looked at Mazel with a slightly raised brow. The princess quickly added that she had been the one to ask. She said she would love to hear more of their stories. Werner looked at the two of them sitting there, and before long all three of them were laughing together over the memories. The day after the special ceremony, Werner knew that a peaceful school life was impossible for him. As he stood there, Nadia gently touched his chest. She told him that she really wanted the two of them to find some time to talk alone. Werner could hardly believe that noble girls were trying to attract him so openly, and it kept happening over and over again. He gave her a polite answer, promising to meet her as soon as he had a chance. Werner thought about how the school campus was just like a smaller version of high society. It was common for powerful noble families to have teachers who supported them. However, he felt it was far too bold and shameless for a professor to call him to a room just to leave him alone with a waiting girl. He realized Nadia was not the only one doing this. Noble women did not have the freedom to love whoever they wanted, which meant her parents had likely forced her into this situation. Nadia then took hold of his hand and pressed him about making that meeting happen. Werner felt a little sorry for her, but at the same time, he was completely sick and tired of these constant traps. Nadia smiled and pushed for a more specific plan, demanding that Werner give her a firm promise. When Werner secretly reached for the doorknob, he discovered the door was locked. He thought about how carefully she had planned everything. Since the teacher was helping her, Werner knew that nobody would come looking for him, even if he missed his regular classes. Suddenly, both Werner and Nadia jumped in surprise as Drexler walked into the room. Drexler acted surprised to see them together and offered a quick apology. Werner let out a quiet sigh of relief, glad that he had made his own safety plans ahead of time. He reminded himself that a person could never be too careful around noble girls and the way they were raised. Nadia asked Drexler if they could help him with something. Drexler explained that Professor Ryden had sent him to collect a massive statue, and he lifted the cover to show how huge it was. He then asked Nadia if she minded if he took Werner away to help him move it. Nadia claimed she did not mind at all and told him to go ahead. She then asked to be excused and walked away with angry, heavy steps. Once she was gone, Werner thanked Drexler for saving him. Drexler told him not to worry about it, noting that Mazel had also followed his instructions perfectly. Werner asked what Professor Ryden had said about the situation. Drexler shared that the professor wanted to hear Mazel's stories about the demons, so they had gone away together. The professor had also told Drexler that he could use his name in an emergency, and Drexler was very glad to have relied on that help just a moment ago. Werner thought about Professor Ryden, a man born as a commoner who became a teacher at the direct request of the Crown Prince. Werner had a gut feeling that this professor would help him in a difficult situation, and it turned out his feeling was right. He imagined that the prince had many people working inside the school to carry out his plans, and he wondered what they talked about. Still, it was a shame that Werner could not trust all the teachers to support him, as many of them probably had their eyes on him too. Even though Werner's efforts to keep Mazel safe were a bit extreme, he felt sure the professor would listen to his feedback, which made him feel much better. Werner apologized to Drexler for causing him so much trouble. Drexler said it was totally fine, though he joked that he hoped Werner would look kindly on him in the future when he became a count. Werner told him to stop talking like that. Drexler then suggested that Werner should just find someone to marry and settle down with. But Werner replied that doing so would only cause him an even bigger headache. Drexler pointed out that Werner's fame was already very high after the demon stampede, but after yesterday's title ceremony, his status seemed to be as high as the sky. As they walked along, various girls stared at Werner, which left him completely speechless. He did not have the time, mental space, or energy to think about that part of his future. The traditional noble customs regarding marriage and engagements were already a massive trouble for him. He wished he could just go about his life avoiding all of it, especially since he did not even know if he would survive what was coming. Drexler asked if that was really how things stood, and Werner confirmed that it was. Werner then asked what they were going to do with the large object they were carrying. Drexler answered that the statue was an excellent tool to keep nosy people away, so they should carry it all the way to their classroom. Later on, they met up with Mazel, who let out a deep sigh and said that he could finally relax. Werner told him that he looked completely exhausted. Mazel tiredly agreed, saying that he truly was. Werner thought to himself that classes would soon be over for the day. He noticed the other students staring at him, and he realized that simply returning to the dormitories would not make things any easier for him. He let out a heavy sigh, feeling a strange sense of familiarity about the stressful situation. Turning to Mazel, Werner told him that if he ever felt unsafe in his own quarters, he was completely free to use Werner's room in the dormitory instead, even offering to give him a spare key. Mazel was quite surprised by this generous offer, but Werner explained that it must be incredibly difficult to sleep with constant alertness, even for someone as strong as a hero. Mazel gratefully accepted the key, promising that he would remain watchful at all times, but if the situation became truly dangerous, he would definitely take refuge in Werner's room. He thanked Werner sincerely for his kindness. Werner felt fairly sure that nothing terrible would happen immediately. However, he reasoned that while bad actors might easily break into a commoner's room, entering the private quarters of a high-ranking noble was a much more serious and dangerous matter. Mazel then asked Werner about his plans for the rest of the day, to which Werner replied that he only had a scheduled meeting at the castle. Once that briefing was finished, he planned to head straight home because he had a great deal of important preparation to complete. Mazel acknowledged this, and his expression suddenly turned very serious. He told Werner to listen closely, explaining that he wanted him to meet a certain person who had assisted him during the recent demon stampede. Werner narrowed his eyes as he thought about the name Lugens Laser. He recognized him as an adventurer who had skipped the recent award ceremony, but was actually a central character in the game World Werner knew. According to the game's original timeline, this man and the hero were supposed to form a duo immediately following the demon stampede, although it now seemed there were actually two other individuals involved in their group as well. Werner agreed to the meeting, saying he did not mind at all, but he asked how many people they would be meeting. Mazel clarified that it was just the one person, adding that he believed they could fully trust him. Werner remembered that in the game, Lugens was destined to help defeat the Demon Lord. Since Werner was now acting as Mazel's primary link to the castle, he knew it was vital to establish contact with this adventurer. Werner accepted Mazel's judgment, and Mazel mentioned that he needed to speak with Lugens about a private matter anyway. Mazel promised to inform Werner of the best date and time for the meeting, and Werner thanked him before looking around the area. Werner noticed the time and told Mazel that the school day was almost over, instructing him to carry out their plan as soon as the bell rang, which Mazel understood completely. When the bell finally rang, the surrounding students watched in absolute shock as Mazel suddenly threw open a window and leaped right out of it. The other students cried out in disbelief, rushing to look outside and shouting about the incredible height from which Mazel had just jumped. As Werner calmly walked out of the classroom, he reflected on how the hero was always the center of attention. He noted that only someone as powerful as Mazel could survive such a high drop without a single scratch. He also realized with a bit of amusement that it had been decades since he himself had last run down a school hallway. A few hours later, the head servant, Norbert, welcomed Werner back home and praised him for getting through his first day back at school after such a long absence. Norbert asked if everything had gone smoothly at the castle, and Werner confirmed that it had. Werner added that he would not need to visit the castle very often from now on, meaning he would likely be home much earlier the following day. He told Norbert that he would make a list of supplies he needed for his room and asked the servant to gather them later, which Norbert agreed to do. Werner then asked about his father's whereabouts, and Norbert informed him that his father had not yet come back. Werner was not surprised by this news. He knew that his father was not only busy dealing with the cleanup after the demon attack, but was also facing spreading rumors about the return of the Demon Lord, leaving him with an immense amount of difficult work. Norbert asked if Werner had an important message for his father, and Werner explained that he wanted to ask him for some advice. He promised to write down his thoughts later so Norbert could deliver the message at the right moment, and Norbert agreed to handle it carefully. Norbert then asked about Werner's plans for the rest of the evening and whether he would be eating dinner in the main dining room. Werner declined, explaining that he intended to do some training, so he preferred to have his meal brought up to his room after he finished taking his bath. Norbert gently warned him not to push himself too hard, but Werner thanked him and assured him that he would be careful, as he simply wanted to organize his thoughts and take things easy. Norbert accepted his wishes, but as Werner walked away, the head servant and the other staff members looked on with deep concern. A female servant remarked that this dedicated behavior was just like Werner, noting that she always knew he was not the kind of person to become arrogant just because he received a new title. However, She worried that he could not keep living the same way under the weight of his heavy new responsibilities, especially since he was still just a young, growing boy. A male servant spoke up, promising to inform the kitchen staff to prepare a highly nutritious meal for Lord Werner. Another female servant added that she would bring him some tea before bed to ensure he got a sound sleep. Norbert looked at the two determined servants in surprise before smiling and agreeing with them, noting that they would all keep a close watch over their young master, a choice that the rest of the servants fully supported. Outside, Werner stood with the tip of his spear resting in the ground. He thought to himself that his duties at the castle would not be a very big problem, and his schoolwork was completely manageable. He knew there was nobody out there who could match Mazel's physical ability, meaning the hero would easily escape from any dangerous situation. Furthermore, Mazel's departure to defeat the Demon Lord was likely not too far in the future. Werner admitted that if this stressful situation had no end in sight, it would definitely get tough. Before pulling his spear out of a training dummy, it had pierced completely through. His thoughts began to deepen as he considered how strange it felt to be in contact with major game characters like Laura and Luggins. Laura's voice sounded exactly as he had expected, which made him feel that this world truly matched the game he used to know. Ever since he was reborn into this place, Werner had tried his absolute hardest to keep from forgetting any piece of information by writing his memories down and burning them immediately so people would not mistake them for prophecies. That information was proving to be very handy now and would continue to be useful later if the main storyline did not change. However, a few things did not feel quite right to him. Werner had discovered many things since his rebirth that he had known nothing about before, such as the true nature of the nobility, unmapped towns, working waterworks, and magic stones. He reasoned that perhaps this information was simply considered too minor for the game's limited memory. He stabbed his spear through the dummy once more as he kept thinking. The real issue was the mysterious black stone that fell from the monster Mazel had defeated, which Werner had absolutely no memory of despite its apparent importance. He realized he knew nothing about how this living world truly related to the game, and since his mind started to get lost trying to figure out, he forced himself to stop overthinking and look for a middle ground. Because of this, Werner knew he needed to set his plans in motion as quickly as possible. His first goal was to get official permission to form a merchant convoy so he could secure proper equipment from Mazel's group and strengthen the capital city's defenses. To achieve this, he would need to submit a formal request to his father and the crown prince. While it would require some careful looking into, his new noble title gave him access to much more information, so the process should not take very long at all. As for his idea for group training, he remembered that not everyone was aware of the Demon Lord's return yet, so his very first step would be talking directly to Max and the other students. Meanwhile, back inside the house, Norbert bowed respectfully as Werner's mother entered the area. Outside, Werner remained deep in his own thoughts, planning to meet up with Luggins and Mazel in 2 days. Until that meeting took place, he decided he would make a copy of a certain important item. Even though a copy would not change the situation on its own, he wanted to use his slightly free time to write down his current concerns before he accidentally forgot them. Lady Zerfeld called out to Werner, but he was so lost in his thoughts that he did not hear her. He also wanted to quickly jot down some ideas about what he could achieve by using magic. His mother took a deep breath and shouted his name loudly, causing him to jump in surprise and quickly answer her. She questioned him about what had happened to his promise of doing only light training, pointing out that his passion was admirable, but she could not have him causing unnecessary worry for the household servants. She reminded him that he had gone straight from spending days recovering in bed to swinging a heavy spear around. Werner apologized and assured her that he was almost finished for the day. When she said his name again with a serious tone, he looked down in fear, shouted that he would wash up immediately, and quickly ran away from her. Werner concluded to himself that while he had many unanswered questions about this world, he knew one thing for certain, which was that terrifying mothers existed in every single reality. Hermine sat comfortably in the first garden and acknowledged Tyrone as he walked into the area. She questioned whether he was heading off to practice his combat skills at such a late hour, and Tyrone confirmed that he was, explaining that there was no guarantee another monster attack would not suddenly happen. Hermine agreed with his cautious thinking and expressed her deep desire to be officially recognized and honored as a knight by Princess Laura this time around. This thought reminded her of recent news, and she mentioned that it seemed Fort Warisa was scheduled to be rebuilt. Tyrone acknowledged this, explaining that Marquis Neep was going to manage the entire restoration project personally. Hermine remarked that this active role sounded exactly like the Marquis, and Tyrone noted that their father had ordered him the previous night to meet and welcome the Marquis as soon as he arrived. Tyrone looked closely at Hermine and inquired if she planned to join him for the welcome. She asked in return if the Marquis's son, Mangold, would be traveling with his father. Tyrone replied that he saw no reason why the son would stay behind. Hermine then explained that she would gladly attend if her current schedule allowed for it, though she still had her duties caring for the knights to consider. Tyrone agreed with her responsibilities. Internally, Hermine focused entirely on her ultimate goal of finally receiving her knighthood directly from Princess Laura. Elsewhere, a horse ran past at a fast gallop, with a group of winded soldiers chasing closely behind it. The soldiers finally caught up to the stopped horse and paused to catch their breath. Werner informed the men that their practice was finished for the day and noted that this exercise felt quite different from dealing with a real demon stampede. One soldier agreed, mentioning that being flexible and adaptable was highly necessary in their line of work. Another soldier added that they truly needed to get used to following specific, sudden orders right on the spot. Max pointed out that they also had to plan out exactly what actions to take if the number of enemy forces unexpectedly multiplied. Inside his mind, Werner completely agreed with Max's smart observations and felt pleased that the men were doing so well. He instructed Max to have the soldiers take turns pretending to be the target whenever Werner was not around to guide them, and Max accepted the command respectfully. Max then suggested that they should arrange some additional lessons in horseback riding, noting that the person making an attack needed to be incredibly careful as well. Werner apologized for his own mistake during the drill and promised to be much more mindful in the future, which brought a smile to Max's face. The group then turned their attention to Origin, who announced that he would be acting as Werner's practice partner for the day. Werner smiled and accepted the offer gratefully. The rest of the soldiers gathered around in a circle to watch the match, and Max shouted for the fight to start. Origin launched into a very fast attack, forcing Werner to defend against a series of powerful strikes. Realizing that he was constantly being pushed backward, Werner decided to leap back to create some distance. Origin aggressively moved forward to close the gap, but he quickly shifted away when Werner tried to thrust his weapon forward. This missed thrust left Werner completely unprotected, giving Origin the perfect opening to strike back. Origin's heavy blow landed squarely, causing Werner to crash hard on the ground. Origin smiled down at him, remarking that Werner had almost caught him for a brief second and was clearly improving his fighting skills. Werner expressed his happiness at the compliment, but privately wondered if the knight was actually being sarcastic. Even though he felt incredibly thankful that his family's personal guards were so powerful, he deeply wished he could improve enough to match their skill level. Origin explained that since Werner had grown much tougher recently, he had allowed himself to fight a bit harder, and he asked if the young master was injured. Werner assured him that he was not fragile at all. Werner remembered a time when he foolishly believed he could just abandon the capital city, run away to a distant place, and survive on his own, but real life had quickly shattered that illusion. He told Origin that just being taken seriously by a skilled warrior was a great honor and urged him not to worry about it, prompting Origin to offer an apology. As Werner checked his arm for injuries, Barkey spoke up and scolded Origin for taking a simple practice match far too seriously. Barkey then provided Werner with helpful advice, explaining that if he focused on balancing his left side more, he would not lose his footing when throwing spear strikes. Werner thanked him for the tip, but secretly questioned if his constant losses were simply because he was a perfectly ordinary person. However, he quickly realized that his opponent was a professional warrior who trained for a living, making the outcome entirely natural. A nearby soldier called out to Werner to let him know that it was time to depart, and Werner signaled that he would join them immediately. As he cleaned himself up, Werner shifted his mindset, realizing that being an ordinary person actually meant there was far more room for him to grow and achieve things, which was ultimately a positive attribute. He resolved not to let his lack of natural talent make him feel bad, deciding instead to focus entirely on doing the absolute best he could. As his carriage finally drove away from the training grounds, he firmly concluded that he could not afford to reduce his daily practice time under any circumstances. Werner resolved to simply do his absolute best as he stepped into the lively tavern. Inside, Luggins introduced himself to Werner and expressed that it was good to meet him, while Werner introduced himself in return and stated that the pleasure was entirely his. Luggins stared closely at him, prompting Mazel to point out that Werner was not stuck up like other noblemen, an observation that Luggins quickly agreed with. Inside his mind, Werner remembered from the game's backstory that Luggins intensely disliked the nobility, which made him realize that meeting the adventurer strictly as Mazel's friend had been the perfect decision. Luggins mentioned that he had already heard similar positive things about Werner from Gok, though he noted that meeting someone in person was always a completely different experience. Werner recognized the name Gok as the mercenary captain from the recent demon stampede who had served as an excellent squad leader. He recalled his father mentioning that Gok was receiving special financial compensation for his service, making Werner reflect on how small this world truly was since mercenaries and adventurers frequently cross paths. Luggins then shared that Gok had praised Werner for being quite handy with a spear. This unexpected compliment made Werner genuinely happy, and he internally hoped that if he kept practicing diligently, he might actually win a real fight someday. Luggins grinned and added that Gok was never the type of man to flatter a nobleman with false praise, so Werner should consider himself very lucky and keep his chin up. Looking at the adventurer, Werner recalled that Luggins possessed a special skill known as weapons master, which made him highly proficient with many different types of arms. Although he could not compare to Mazel's overwhelming strength, Luggins was destined to become a reliable, older brother figure to the hero from the very start of the game until the final battle. Back in Werner's original world, this character had been incredibly popular among both male and female players. Luggins remarked to Werner that he was completely different from the image he had formed in his mind, before suggesting that they should finally eat some meat and ale if it was fancy enough for them. Werner agreed to the meal, while silently wondering what kind of person the adventurer had expected him to be. Once their food was served, Luggins cut straight to the chase by saying that while Mazel had wanted them to meet, he highly doubted they were there just to trade empty pleasantries. He directly asked what important matter had caused them to call him out to the tavern. Werner and Mazel exchanged a quick glance, and Werner began by asking if it was true that mercenaries and adventurers were strictly sworn to secrecy. Luggins confirmed that this was absolutely correct. Werner then revealed the massive secret that rumors indicated the Demon Lord had officially revived. Luggins choked on his drink in shock, warning Werner that such a dangerous topic was not something to joke about, but Werner quietly insisted that he deeply wished it were a mere joke. Luggins demandingly questioned why Werner would choose to share such terrifying news in a common tavern. Werner explained that summoning a prominent adventurer to a noble estate would attract far too much unwanted attention from outside eyes. He reasoned that a noisy public bar was actually the safest place because people would have to lean in and pay incredibly close attention just to overhear their conversation. Luggins admitted that Mazel had been entirely correct about Werner, adding that it was truly difficult to believe that Werner was still just a school student. Werner looked over at Mazel, wondering what kind of things his friend had been telling the adventurer beforehand. Luggins clarified that his remark was a genuine compliment and gave Werner his full attention, asking why he was being trusted with this heavy secret. Werner got straight to the point, explaining that he desperately wanted Luggins to help and protect Mazel. He noted that while the threat had not been confirmed with absolute certainty by the kingdom yet, Mazel would undoubtedly be ordered by the king to defeat the Demon Lord once the truth came to light. Luggins asked Mazel if he was being kept fully informed about these heavy expectations, and Werner chimed in to say that he was willing to do absolutely anything within his power to support them. Luggins acknowledged this deep commitment. Luggins pointed out that Werner was essentially acting as Mazel's personal link to the royal family, which was vital since the country had very limited options to act without clear proof. He noted that because Mazel was still a student who completely lacked real adventure experience, he would gladly step in to accompany the hero and fight right by his side. Mazel eagerly asked Luggins to teach him everything he could from his extensive combat experience, and Luggins readily agreed to turn Mazel into a true warrior, which brought a joyful smile to the hero's face. Werner expressed his deepest possible gratitude to the adventurer, but Luggins told him to keep things simple with a basic thank you and asked what specific tasks they needed him to perform first. Werner responded by pulling out a secret document for them to inspect. As Luggins and Mazel looked closely at the paper, Mazel quietly muttered Werner's name in utter shock as he realized exactly what his friend had created. Mazel looked closely at the rough drawings on the paper and asked what it was supposed to be. Werner thought to himself that he should not be surprised by their confusion, though their lack of knowledge was not a good sign for his own plans. He told both Luggins and Mazel to stop staring at him with such intense curiosity, promising that he would explain everything clearly. After listening to Werner's detailed breakdown, Luggins finally understood the idea of sending out a merchant convoy to gather high-quality equipment. The adventurer agreed that the plan made a lot of sense because there were exceptionally good items available in those specific regions. Werner explained that because he wanted to secure the highest quality items possible, he needed Luggins to carefully choose the right adventurers and mercenaries to serve as guards for the journey. He reasoned that people in Luggins' line of work would be very familiar with these kinds of dangerous escort missions. Luggins readily accepted the task and told him to leave the responsibility entirely to him. Mazel then brought up the issue of funding, asking how they would pay for all these supplies. Werner clarified that the initial costs would be covered by his own family's noble budget, but the kingdom's government would ultimately pay them back for the entire expense. He revealed that he had already obtained his father's permission for this arrangement, noting that having the backing of the Crown Prince's command was incredibly helpful. Furthermore, since the Prime Minister was also fully aware of the Demon Lord's return, their official discussions had gone very smoothly. Mazel questioned how Werner could be so certain that the kingdom would cover the final bill. Werner told him not to worry about it, explaining that once they made a clean, official copy of the map he drew, they would easily get all the funding they needed from the authorities. He jokingly warned them not to go sell the valuable map to anyone else. Luggins playfully addressed Werner with a formal title, remarking that he was a very unusual person. Mazel defended his friend by telling Luggins not to call Werner strange, though he admitted he understood why the adventurer felt that way. Mazel pointed out that he had never met anyone who possessed so much detailed knowledge about the continent and its various settlements, especially since Mazel himself had never even seen a map before, yet Werner was somehow drawing one entirely from scratch. Werner explained that maps were not even available at their school campus, adding that the details he currently understood were still only a tiny fraction of what actually existed in the wider world. Inside his mind, Werner reflected on how maps in this reality were treated as highly classified state secrets for national security reasons, meaning it was completely natural that a commoner like Mazel had never encountered one. However, because his current survival strategies absolutely required a geographical guide, Werner had combined the scattered bits of information he had picked up in his new life with his own memories of the video game's overworld. Through this method, he had successfully created a comprehensive world map highlighting specific towns that contained excellent merchant shops or served as the settings for critical events in the game's story. Mazel remarked that an ordinary school student would never think or plan in such an advanced, strategic way. Luggins chimed in, stating that if anyone asked for his opinion, Werner acted much more like a highly educated scholar than a student. Werner thought to himself that it was perfectly normal for regular people to be completely ignorant about future events like the return of the Demon Lord, noting that most individuals lived perfectly normal lives without knowing what lay ahead, a reality that became very clear to him while he was drawing his map. He also realized that this living world contained many real towns that were never even mentioned in the original game. Even his own family's noble territory had never made an appearance in the game's storyline. Furthermore, the game players were never introduced to local nobles or political authority figures, nor did the game show any massive private estates or mansions belonging to feudal lords. The only time Werner could recall a lord even being mentioned in the game was a single storyline involving a distant town where a powerful demon had secretly stolen a noble's identity and taken his place. Mazel advised Werner that he should make sure to train hard and improve his own physical skills as well. This comment caused Werner to pause and think deeply for a brief moment before a sudden memory struck him. He instructed Mazel to travel directly south until he encountered a river, and then follow that river toward the east. Werner explained that Mazel would eventually spot a dense forest on his left side, and if he ventured deep inside that forest, he would find an ancient shrine that spawned a constant, never-ending wave of dangerous monsters. He suggested that Mazel use that specific location to test his combat strength. Luggins smirked at the highly specific directions and asked what kind of strange thoughts were running through Werner's noble mind. Werner covered up the truth by replying that he simply possessed a deep personal interest in the study of monster behaviors and habitats. He reminded himself that he absolutely could not reveal the real truth, which was that the ancient shrine was a well-known location used for repetitive experience training early in the video game. Luggins remarked to Mazel that Werner was becoming weirder by the minute, a sentiment that Mazel fully agreed with. Luggins admitted that despite the strangeness of the source, he could not deny that the ancient shrine would serve as an excellent training ground for them. Mazel agreed with the suggestion and stated that he and Luggins should go there to practice fighting alongside each other as a team. Werner noted that they should plan this training trip for a time when he did not have regular school classes to attend, and Mazel expressed his sincere appreciation for the arrangement. Deep in his own thoughts, Werner turned his attention back to the abandoned Fort Warisa, reasoning that the official order to rebuild the outpost was likely a major sign that the fort would soon become a crowded center of activity, just as it had been during the events of the game. Because of this, Werner believed they would have enough time to prepare until the restoration of the fort was completely finished. As they finished eating their meal, Luggins announced that it was time for them to leave, and Werner replied that he would follow them outside the tavern. While paying for their food, Werner reflected on the reality that no matter how much he prepared, he would ultimately have no choice but to leave the final battle in the hands of the hero and his companions. He realized that the absolute best he could do for now was to raise his own strength and skills. He thought about how easy it was for players in his past life to mock the non-player characters who blindly trusted the fate of the entire world to a tiny group of heroes. However, living as one of those secondary characters himself, he knew with absolute certainty that he could never truly match Mazel's incredible growth, and trying to fight alongside him would only hold the hero back. Therefore, he resolved to focus entirely on the specific tasks he was actually capable of handling. Mazel agreed with him, and a few minutes later, as they were parting ways, the hero called out to Werner to say that he would see him back at school. Werner acknowledged this and bid him farewell until their next school day. Privately, Werner's thoughts turned to his upcoming schedule, and he worriedly noted that before he could meet with his friend again, he would have to pull off an incredibly risky plan the very next day, a stressful thought that made his stomach physically ache with anxiety. Meanwhile, inside the royal palace, the king questioned his son about the ongoing situation regarding Fort Warisa. The crown prince reported that the entire project was moving along very well, explaining that the formal renovations would begin in earnest the moment Marquis Neep arrived at the site. The king then inquired about the secret investigation into the rumored return of the Demon Lord. The crown prince explained that the current evidence was purely based on rumors and circumstances, though he noted there had been a significant amount of suspicious talk coming from lands beyond their borders, specifically from the regions of Salzanak and Triad. The king acknowledged this finding and stated that he expected his son to maintain a highly thorough investigation into the matter, a command that the crown prince understood and accepted completely. The crown prince further explained that the planned reorganization of the kingdom's knighthood was nearly finished, noting that they were incredibly fortunate to have suffered very few casualties during the recent crisis. He added that the official process of evaluating the true military strength of the local volunteer militia was moving forward without encountering any issues, meaning the royal family had absolutely nothing to worry about on that front. The king then changed the subject and asked how the discussions had gone with the young viscount. The crown prince shared that the young noble claimed to have no hidden political agenda whatsoever, insisting that his only goal was to maintain a genuine friendship with the hero. When the king questioned whether his son could truly verify that claim, the crown prince admitted that while he initially suspected the young man had hidden motives, he could deeply sense the honesty behind his spoken words. He also noted that the young man's school instructors had officially reported that his humble personality and general behavior had not changed at all since the monster stampede. Hearing this, the king concluded that they should be able to safely trust the young noble for the time being. The king then inquired about the current status of the hero himself. The crown prince revealed that several prominent noble houses had resorted to rather aggressive and forceful measures to get close to the hero, though he firmly believed that none of these families would cause any serious problems for the throne. The king remarked that it might actually be quite fortunate that the royal family had made their own strategic moves regarding the hero when they did, and he officially left the responsibility of managing those pushy noble families entirely to his son, an assignment the prince respectfully accepted. The crown prince added that young Viscount Zerfeld had actually been providing a massive amount of valuable assistance to the hero on the school campus. The king reasoned that as long as the Zerfeld family had no secret intentions of formally adopting the hero into their own household, the young man would serve as a perfectly adequate middleman between the hero and the royal court. The crown prince agreed with this assessment, though he pointed out that the young man showed a distinct lack of political cunning compared to typical noblemen. The king perceptively noted that his son seemed quite pleased by this rare trait. The crown prince explained that the young man was slightly older than his own son and possessed absolutely no personal ambition, yet he still displayed an impressive natural ability to command others. He stated that he had no complaints whatsoever about the young man's family lineage and believed he would make an excellent candidate to serve as a royal aide in the future. The king agreed that this current situation provided the perfect opportunity to watch the young man closely and determine whether Werner could truly be useful to the kingdom. The crown prince concurred and shared his plan to hold a formal private meeting with Werner the very next day while the hero was away, which would serve as an ideal chance to evaluate his true character once again. The king expressed mild surprise at this quick action, prompting the crown prince to smile and state that he was genuinely looking forward to seeing exactly what kind of proposal Werner would bring before him. This world also operated on a 7-day-week system. Many daily aspects of life were exactly the same as in Werner's previous world, including dealing with livestock and fish, running commerce, working in blacksmithing, hunting, rearing animals, practicing the arts, practicing religion, and celebrating birthdays. Even superstitious practices, such as scheduling weddings only on days considered lucky or auspicious, were strictly followed here. Werner had initially assumed that the specific names given to the days of the week meant the culture held a polytheistic worldview filled with various gods and goddesses, but he discovered that the people actually followed a single, monotheistic belief system. It happened to be Werner's birthday today, which was also an official holiday, but he knew that public holidays did not matter when it came to important affairs of royal interest. During his audience, the crown prince explained that he understood the main points of Werner's proposal and found the ideas very fascinating. The prince requested that Werner forgive him, as he could only add these new weapons to the royal knighthood's official arsenal after personally reviewing and approving the items themselves. Werner assured the prince that this condition was perfectly fine, as his main hope was simply to secure His Highness's royal approval in advance. The crown prince expressed his understanding of Werner's need to obtain official permission and noted how glad he was that Werner had brought this matter to his attention ahead of time. However, the prince questioned whether Werner truly believed he could successfully procure such exceptionally high-quality weaponry, and Werner confirmed that he could, based on the information he had managed to find out. The Crown Prince pointed out that it would be ideal if these weapons could be purchased within their own borders, but he noted that the local ancient kingdom's ruins had already been completely cleared out. Inside his mind, Werner remembered how he had casually followed the game's story starting right from the royal capital, where the majority of available equipment consisted of low-level starting gear. As soon as a player left the capital area, luxury items, rare ingredients, fine fabrics, and high-level armaments became abundant. Since Luggins had also confirmed that high-performing gear could be found in this country, Werner wondered why the distant border towns possessed far better equipment and cheaper prices than the capital. Werner explained to the prince that he had carefully checked over the kingdom's latest official excavation records just to be entirely safe, discovering that almost all the discovered weapons had already been sold off, except for a few items kept for historical research value. Werner reflected on how these powerful, high-level pieces of equipment were actually historical items excavated from ancient ruins, particularly from old tombs dating back to the era of the ancient kingdom. He realized the process was essentially a form of organized grave robbing. According to the old reports, large numbers of armed bodies have been buried together in massive graves during ancient times. While some valuable items were recovered from dangerous dungeons, a massive percentage of similar gear came from these exact historical burial circumstances, with rare items specifically being pulled from the decorative furnishings of the tombs. Because of this lucrative trade, various towns and small villages dedicated to selling excavated goods had popped up rapidly all around the major ruin sites. The ancient armor typically went straight to specialized goldsmiths, while the remaining items were managed by second-hand dealers. Werner admitted to the Crown Prince that he did not possess the exact numerical data regarding these items yet, and the prince acknowledged that this lack of details was to be expected. Werner secretly reasoned that because the Kingdom of Wine already possessed an overwhelmingly powerful military force on the continent, the rulers likely felt no pressing need to pay attention to advanced equipment or specialized magic items. It remained a massive mystery to him why the powerful gear and enchanted objects commonly traded in foreign nations were completely overlooked or unknown within their own country. He wondered if this neglect was a deliberate choice made out of consideration for local merchant guilds, perhaps to prevent a sudden drop in market prices for items pulled from nearby dungeons. Werner then informed the prince that he was currently working on how to properly organize and present a full report on the matter, and the Crown Prince encouraged him to give it a try, earning a respectful thank you from Werner. After Werner finished presenting his full report, the Crown Prince praised his efforts and stated that he fully understood Werner's desire to set up an emergency beacon system to warn the kingdom in the event of a sudden demon attack. The prince promised to pass all of this valuable information along to Marquis Neep, which Werner noted would be incredibly helpful. The Crown Prince added that Fort Warisa was located a relatively short distance away, meaning that if an enemy attack actually occurred, the kingdom would gain a massive defensive advantage by knowing about the danger immediately, even if the assault happened in the dead of night. The prince then asked if Werner had any other matters to discuss, and Werner confirmed that this was everything. The Crown Prince instructed Werner to notify him immediately the moment any new situations arose, and Werner respectfully gave his word to do so. Werner thought to himself that he would see himself out of the palace. As he departed, the Crown Prince turned to his attendants and asked for their honest thoughts regarding the young noble. The first attendant remarked that Werner was remarkably well composed and put together for someone so young, noting that his research methods were highly efficient, methodical, and free of unnecessary waste. The second attendant added that while everything would ultimately depend on the final results of his ideas, it was a real shame that such a capable young man was merely the son of a count. The Crown Prince closed his eyes tightly before stating that the fact that historic excavated items were being carted completely outside their national borders was a serious problem. This was assuming, of course, that the rare items Viscount Zerfeld had read about actually existed in those places. The prince decided it was best to take swift action, ordering his attendants to immediately prepare defensive countermeasures for any newly discovered ruins within their territory and to launch thorough investigations into all excavation personnel. The attendants respectfully accepted his commands. Meanwhile, Werner entered a local tavern, where a man with wavy hair immediately greeted him, expressing that it was good to see him, Viscount Zerfeld. The man gestured toward a private room and politely invited Werner to step right inside. Inside his mind, Werner could hardly believe that the man had recognized his identity before he could even introduce himself, and he was surprised that the man already knew all about his brand new noble title. He realized this impressive awareness was exactly what one should expect from the famous Bierstedt Trading Company, since they were not managed by a prominent figure in the capital's commercial guild for nothing. The wavy-haired man rang a small bell and asked Werner to wait there for just a brief moment, explaining that the company head, Bierstedt, would join him shortly. Werner sat down and carefully observed the room. He thought about how he had asked for a massive favor by acquiring all that fragrant oil recently. But since he had paid the full asking price without hesitation, the company must have made a very tidy profit from the transaction. He felt incredibly lucky that the kingdom's government had provided the necessary funds for it. Werner reminded himself to remain highly watchful when dealing with such experienced and cunning merchants. However, compared to his recent encounters with royal figures who could have easily ordered his execution and sent his head rolling if he made a single mistake, dealing with a businessman felt like an absolute breeze. A man soon entered the private room and offered Werner a polite apology for making him wait. He introduced himself as Bierstedt, the official representative of the Bierstedt Trading Company. Werner assured him that the wait was not a problem at all, acknowledging that he was the one who had suddenly shown up without any prior notice. Bierstedt expressed his gratitude for those kind words, admitting that he could scarcely believe his ears when he was told that the young Viscount had come to visit his establishment in person. Werner thanked the merchant for their successful business transaction the other day. Bierstedt then mentioned that he had heard all about Werner's heroic exploits during the recent monster stampede, praising his brave actions as highly commendable. Werner thanked him and expressed his appreciation for how quickly Bierstedt had accommodated his sudden, massive order. He then explained that the reason for his visit was to formally request the setup and procurement of a specialized merchant convoy. Werner made it clear that he would personally hire and pay for the necessary guards to protect the journey. Werner noticed a sharp, assessing glare in Bierstedt's eyes, and inside his mind, he could not blame the merchant for being deeply suspicious. He knew that even though he held the title of a Viscount, this massive and complex trade deal was definitely not the type of project a regular student would normally propose. Werner slid a set of documents across the table toward the merchant, explaining that the papers contained a precise list of the specific towns he intended to send the convoy to, along with the exact items he planned to purchase. Separately, he requested that the company verify the current inventory levels in each of those designated towns. Bierstedt asked for permission to examine the documents, which Werner granted. The merchant studied the paperwork intensely, remarking that the requested items were quite rare, yet completely authentic. Inside his head, Werner felt certain that just looking over this highly detailed information was already sparking a brand new business idea in the merchant's mind. Werner pointed out to Bierstedt that while it had become common knowledge by now, the recent monster stampede was completely unlike anything the kingdom had ever experienced before. Bierstedt firmly agreed with that statement. Werner explained that the rampaging demons had caused absolute havoc, and there was no guarantee that a second or even a third wave of attacks would not strike them in the near future. Inside his mind, Werner knew that a powerful network of information existed among the merchants who frequently visited the royal palace, and the authorities were not forcing them to keep quiet about the monsters. It was entirely natural for Bierstedt to know these facts, and the merchant might even have started hearing quiet whispers regarding the rebirth of the demon lord, even if he could not openly say so. Werner further explained to Bierstedt that his recent actions during the crisis had left people with a strong impression that he was a rising military figure. Because of this new reputation, he wanted to assemble high-quality equipment for himself, a motivation he trusted the merchant could easily understand. Bierstedt readily agreed, noting that he had indeed heard that Viscount Zerfeld was ranked second in order of merit for his exceptional service. Werner realized it was completely natural for the royal family to hold such high expectations for him, and he offered his sincere thanks to the merchant. Bierstedt looked at him closely and pointed out that this particular project was by no means a small-scale endeavor, meaning the final price would be quite high to match the effort. Werner acknowledged the cost and requested that the merchant deliver exactly 8 high-quality weapons and 8 full sets of armor from the provided list directly to his father's household estate, promising that Bierstedt would be fully compensated for everything. Inside his own mind, Werner admitted that he truly wished he could fully equip the palace's main soldiers, but given his current financial limitations, completely arming even his own family's household was going to be an impossible task. His strategy was to first introduce the kingdom's higher-ups to the existence of this superior, high-level equipment so that they would choose to buy it themselves using the royal treasury at a later date. Bierstedt then inquired about what would happen if he managed to procure a much larger quantity of these rare goods than Werner had requested. Werner replied that he had absolutely no objections to that, as long as his own agreed-upon amount was successfully delivered to his household, leaving the merchant perfectly free to buy and sell any extra items at his own leisure. Werner reasoned that having a major trading company sell this advanced equipment directly within the capital would make the gear widely known to the public, creating a helpful knock-on effect that would ultimately strengthen the capital city's overall defenses. While ordinary noblemen were usually obsessed with monopolizing such rare goods to increase their personal profits, Werner knew that if he were the only one making money while the entire country was wiped out by monsters, his wealth would be completely pointless. Bierstedt looked over the list again and mentioned the names Halbach and Salzen, admitting that he had never heard of these particular towns before. Werner explained that they were located in the foreign regions of Triet and Doritsdam, respectively, promising that he would prepare a map for the journey and noting that he had already secured official border crossing permits from the Crown Prince himself. Bierstedt looked intently at Werner and asked if it would be possible to obtain a copy of that map for his own personal use. As Werner felt the merchant's heavy stare, he thought to himself that if a cunning businessman was this interested, the map itself might be valuable enough to secretly commission and pay for. He wondered if Bierstedt was simply too foolish to realize that owning an accurate map could get a person executed for treason, or if the merchant had a completely different hidden plan in mind. Werner decided to tell him that one of his own trusted people would act as a personal navigator for the convoy, figuring that once the traders traveled the path a single time, they would not need to be shown the way ever again. Bierstedt agreed that a single trip would likely be enough for his men, but he voiced a lingering concern regarding whether they would actually find any equipment that truly met Werner's incredibly high standards. Werner cut him off mid-sentence to say that he completely understood the doubt. Privately, Werner acknowledged that he possessed no concrete evidence that the powerful weapons and rare items from his game memories actually existed in this physical world. However, he reasoned that since the monsters in those distant borders were much stronger than the ones around the capital, the small villages and towns out there could only survive by protecting themselves with high-level gear and specialized magical barrier items. Werner assured Bierstedt that even if the convoy failed to locate the designated goods, Werner himself would still fully cover all the accumulated travel expenses, meaning the merchant did not need to worry about losing money on the venture. Bierstedt expressed his deep appreciation for such a reassuring guarantee. Werner reflected on how the demon army's invasion would only continue to progress as time went on, leaving them with a very brief window of time to travel safely across the lands. Once that safe period ended, it would become completely impossible to acquire these vital items, and any future investigations would become significantly harder to conduct. He wanted to make sure he laid down some proper groundwork before that terrible time arrived. He also considered the possibility that a sudden rush on the inventory might occur, which could cause the local defenses in those border regions to become dangerously lax as each neighboring country scrambled to create its own defensive countermeasures. Ultimately, the total number of advanced equipment pieces and magical items remained completely unknown, much like the exact size of the demon forces, and Werner already had his hands entirely full trying to protect his own country. He knew this chaotic timeline also heavily impacted the defense strategy he was designing for Fort Werisa, meaning he absolutely had to establish a strict order of priorities. Werner directed his carriage driver to take him straight to the local adventurers guild. As the vehicle rolled away, he reminded himself that if he started becoming too greedy or overestimating his own personal abilities, he would only end up causing severe harm to both himself and the people around him. A few hours later, Werner arrived at his destination, where a polite lady welcomed him to the Adventurers Guild and asked how she could assist him with his business today. Werner blinked rather shyly and explained that he was looking to hire some skilled people for a task. The lady realized he wanted to post a formal quest and politely invited him to follow her right this way. As Werner walked behind her, he looked at her gentle appearance and couldn't help but wonder if such a pretty young woman could truly manage to keep order against a massive crowd of rough, rowdy adventurers. Werner wondered if the guild lady was simply so beautiful that none of the rough customers dared to bother her. As he walked deeper into the private room, the surrounding noise quickly faded away, making him realize that the walls were exceptionally soundproof. A man inside recognized him as Viscount Zerfeld and asked what had brought him to the guild. Werner explained that he wanted to submit a formal request for a large-scale scout investigation. He needed skilled individuals to track how often monsters were appearing and to provide necessary security at several specified locations. Because there were so many different sites to cover, Werner knew it would be impossible to investigate them all at once, but he estimated that they would need about 20 scouts in total to get the job done. The man remarked that 20 was quite a large number of personnel to request. Werner explained that he had already organized the specific goals of the investigation by their order of importance, and he wanted the workers to be assigned based on their personal preferences and unique skills. The man inquired whether the scouts would have the right to turn down the mission after listening to the specific details, and Werner confirmed that they absolutely could, adding that he would also provide extra hazard pay wherever it was necessary. The man pointed out that handling the request this way meant they would not be able to publicly post a fixed reward on the guild board. Werner reassured him that the minimum payment would be continuously adjusted based on how difficult each section of the investigation turned out to be. He also promised that the guild itself would receive its standard payment along with an extra financial incentive, which brought a wide smile to the man's face. With those financial details settled, the two men sat down and thoroughly discussed the specific locations. After a significant amount of time had passed, Werner finally stepped outside the Adventurers Guild, thinking about how the meeting had taken forever because of the massive amount of details they had to review. Because his list included several foreign place names, the guild officials had briefly suspected him of secretly preparing for an international war, but he quickly cleared up the misunderstanding. He knew that the guild always tried to stay as far away from political conflict as possible. Despite the long conversation, Werner felt glad that his arrangements were completely finished. He knew that once the scouts returned from their journeys, they would share their accurate findings about monster appearance rates with the guild, which would ultimately help save lives and reduce casualties. A short while later, Werner walked into the nearby Mercenaries Guild, where a worker welcomed him and asked how he could help. Werner stated that he wanted to hire a group of combat guards to protect some traveling merchants, and the worker politely invited him to come inside. Werner noted to himself that both the Adventurers Guild and the Mercenaries Guild were located inside the exact same building, even though it was often quite difficult for regular people to explain the exact difference between the two professions. He reasoned that adventurers mostly focused on exploring dangerous dungeons, usually worked in very small groups, and acted as flexible, multi-skilled individuals who preferred short-term tasks. On the other hand, mercenaries were specifically hired for situations where heavy fighting was fully expected, regardless of whether they were fighting monsters or human enemies. Mercenaries also tended to form large, highly organized groups and were perfectly willing to accept long-term guard assignments. While adventurers gave the impression of preferring independent, solitary action, both groups frequently received similar types of work, so housing both guilds in the same building made the entire hiring process incredibly fast and efficient. Werner looked around the room and found it fascinating that, despite being located right next door to each other, the two guilds had completely different atmospheres. A highly muscular man approached Werner to ask about the guard request, and Werner carefully explained all the details of the upcoming journey. After listening to the explanation, the muscular man nodded and noted that the travel plans made for an incredibly massive project. He estimated that when counting the necessary alternating shifts to keep the merchants safe around the clock, Werner would need to hire roughly 150 mercenaries in total. Werner agreed with the estimate and assured the man that he fully intended to pay a highly appropriate amount of compensation for their hard work, which the muscular man appreciated deeply. Werner reflected on how these guilds maintained a highly beneficial relationship with their members. He knew the organizations used their funds to hold joint funerals for lonely members who had no living relatives, provide financial support for injured workers who could no longer earn a living, and offer safety and care to the families of comrades who died during dangerous missions. Furthermore, maintaining the large guild buildings, paying the regular staff members, and dealing with rowdy individuals who caused physical damage required a massive amount of money. Werner understood that the primary source of the guild's income came from the profits they made by selling valuable monster parts collected by the fighters, as well as the intermediary fees they charged for managing large requests exactly like the one he had just submitted. Werner knew that even if he wanted to save his money, being stingy would not get him anywhere in his current situation. The muscular man from the guild asked him how he would like the men to be chosen for the guard duty. Werner explained that he had already entrusted Lugan's Laser and Oliver Goke with the responsibility of selecting the best candidates. The muscular man was not surprised at all to hear those two names, which felt like a quiet compliment to Werner. This reaction made Werner wonder if the individuals who were destined to join the hero's main party were already widely known and respected among their fellow fighters. With this final detail sorted out, the guild's official preparations were put on hold until everything else was completely ready. Just as Werner was considering his next move, a sudden voice beside him asked if he was offering some kind of work. The stranger introduced himself as Feli and asked if Werner would let him in on the job opportunity. Werner was incredibly surprised by this encounter, reflecting on how he had recently run into Laura and was now meeting yet another crucial person from the game. He turned to the waiter and ordered 2 glasses of juice, while also asking Feli if he wanted some nuts or other snacks to go with the drinks. Feli enthusiastically requested both nuts and dried fruits, leading Werner to order a portion of each. As Feli sat down right next to him, he praised Werner for being exceptionally generous. Werner silently reflected on the boy's identity, recognizing him as Felix Ernert, the exceptionally talented scout who would eventually join the hero's party. Even though Feli was only 14 years old in the game world, his physical and scouting skills were absolutely top-notch, to the point where certain dangerous dungeons could not be completed without him. Werner noted that while the boy had a very cute appearance, he was definitely a male. Werner remarked to Feli that he was quite impressed that the boy had managed to recognize him so easily. Feli explained that there was not a single adventurer in the capital city who did not know who Werner was, adding that Werner's distinctive, long, braided tail of hair made him incredibly easy to pinpoint in a crowd. Werner admitted that he had been growing it for about 10 years now, and when Feli mentioned that it must be difficult to keep clean, Werner agreed that it could occasionally be a real bother. Felly curiously questioned what a high-ranking viscount like Werner was doing in a rough place like the guild building. Werner replied that he was simply doing some shopping to buy up necessary supplies from various towns. Felly jokingly described this as scooping up everything or panic buying, but Werner quickly corrected him, stating that those descriptions were entirely wrong. Werner observed Felly's friendly behavior, realizing that whether the boy was naturally approachable or not, he was always incredibly skilled at getting close to people. He remembered that this talent also made Felly excellent at picking people's pockets, though Werner figured his own purse was safe for now, since Felly would likely be kicked out of the guild if he tried to steal anything inside the building. When Werner asked Felly what his true goal was, Felly admitted that he did not have a specific agenda, and was simply looking for something interesting to do. Werner found the boy to be straightforward yet tricky, recalling that he had struggled to manage similar subordinates in his past life. Werner then offered him a troublesome yet highly thrilling assignment, which immediately caused Felly to grin with genuine interest. Werner was pleased to have caught the scout's attention, knowing how valuable a pawn Felly could be for the hero's future group. He weighed two distinct options for utilizing his skills, which were either to have Felly stay in the capital city to help gather detailed secret intelligence, or to have him accompany the traveling merchant convoy to get a proper lay of the land and the surrounding towns. Werner ultimately decided on the second option, because if the merchant convoy managed to locate rare consumable items like skywalk boots, those tools would prove to be incredibly useful for Felly after he officially joined the hero's party. Werner explained the proposal to Felly, asking him to accompany the merchant convoy and pointing out that the recent monster stampede had likely disrupted the status quo enough to change things in the outer towns. Felly thought about the offer and noted that the journey would take a significant amount of time and sounded quite tough. To sweeten the deal, Werner promised that Felly would get to eat plenty of delicious food in the different towns, explaining that on top of his regular daily allowance, Werner would provide a specific budget just for snacks and meals. Felly smiled at the highly appealing and tasty proposition. Inside his own mind, Werner reasoned that the intelligence collection he was managing on his own end would eventually succeed as long as he dedicated enough time and energy to it. However, properly preparing and optimizing the future strength of Mazel and his close friends would create a massive positive effect on the entire world. When viewing the situation as a necessary investment for that great purpose, Werner considered these high expenses to be a mere drop in the bucket. He silently watched Felly weigh the proposal in his mind, continuing to analyze the boy's behavior. Werner knew Felly was a vital key to everything, but the visible hesitation showed that something personal was deeply bothering him. Even though Werner sensed the boy's genuine interest, he chose not to push too hard, simply repeating that a gathering would take place at his house on the next hunting day and that Felly was completely free to attend if he wished. Werner then placed a heavy pouch filled with coins directly in front of Felly, explaining that the money was meant to cover his initial travel fare. Felly questioned whether the amount was a bit too much for a simple advance, but Werner insisted that it was merely a clear demonstration of his good faith. He told the scout that the money belonged to him regardless of whether he ultimately chose to accept the dangerous quest or turn it down, adding that Felly could freely spend it on his own food or give it away to others without Werner ever uttering a single complaint. Felly stared back at him with a sharp glare. Werner was well aware of Felly's personal backstory, knowing that the boy had grown up in a local orphanage and was precisely the type of reliable person who would get along beautifully with Mazel and the rest of the hero's party. Because of this upbringing, Felly was absolutely not the kind of cold-hearted person who would just walk away on a long journey without looking out for the welfare of his child at home. Werner finally stood up from his seat and suggested that it was time for them to get moving. Felly stuttered slightly as he agreed with the statement. The young scout stared intently at the valuable pouch of coins for a brief moment before finally picking it up, rushing quickly to catch up with Werner's steps and loudly shouting out his sincere thanks. Werner simply waved a quiet goodbye as he walked away, but inside his mind, he reflected on the situation. He acknowledged that it was still a significant gamble whether Felly would choose to completely trust a noble like him, but he ultimately held a very good and confident feeling about the outcome.